Dorne was a land of deep ochres and sun-bleached yellows, a place of deserts with rolling dunes and hidden wells, of olive groves and orange blossoms that perfumed even the hottest midday air. Within the walls of Sunspear, the seat of House Martell, that heat and brightness were mirrored in the hearts of those who called themselves Dornish, passionate, proud, and fiercely protective of their homeland. And yet, for all the scalding sun and the swaying palm trees, for all the courtyards adorned with mosaic tiles depicting coiling serpents and the proud spear that served as the Martell sigil, a chill had begun to creep into the hearts of the prince's court. Rumors from the distant north reached them in bits and pieces. Whispers had always slipped down the continent, overshadowed by talk of wars among noble houses, the undoing of monarchs, and the surging of Sellsword armies. But this time the rumors spoke of a winter so terrible it froze men's souls. They told of pale monstrosities with glimmering blue eyes, of dead men who walked, of an ancient threat stirring beyond the northern boundaries of the realm. More pragmatic lords might have dismissed these stories as the ravings of frightened villagers or the tall tales of travelers seeking free ale, yet the new Prince of Dorne, young, decisive, and unflinchingly idealistic, chose to trust the messenger ravens that arrived bearing dire warnings from Queen Daenerys Targaryen and King Jon, known once as the Bastard of Winterfell. If the warnings were true, the world was indeed tipping into darkness. To remain safe behind the Red Mountains and the scalding dunes while the rest of Westeros fell under a tide of ice and death was not an option for House Martell. They had endured enough of isolation and quiet retribution in the name of avenging past hurts. Yet the new generation, led by Princess Arianne Martell, was determined to place Dorne at the forefront of a fight that, if lost, would spell doom for all. And so it was decided that the Spears of Dorne would march north. The Great War was not a Northman's war alone. It was a war for all the living. No matter how different their climes, from the scorching desert of Dorne to the frozen expanses beyond the Neck, they were all men, all mortals. Arianne said it herself in the council chambers, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, "When death comes, it does not care for the color of our banners." From that moment, a quiet bustle filled Sunspear. Messenger birds were dispatched to the lesser lords and ladies in the outlying keeps: House Fowler, House Jourdain, House Euler, House Ironwood, House Dane. Knights and foot soldiers were called to muster. Horses were prepared, supplies gathered, blacksmiths hunched over their forges night and day to outfit an army capable of not only marching but surviving in a land where the cold might prove as deadly as swords. Cloaks of thick fur were bartered from merchants in Old Town and King's Landing. Wagons of grain and casks of salted fish and dried fruit were packed to sustain the men during a march that might last weeks or even months. Prince Quentyn Martell, revived in the hearts of the Dornish through whispered tales of the adversity he'd once faced far across the sea, had returned from his rumored demise in this new imagining of fate's tapestry. He had nearly perished in Essos, but the prince who came home was tempered like steel in the far-off forges of adversity. Though his scars were still visible on his forearms, markers of an old misadventure with dragons, he carried himself with the calm resolve of a man who had faced death and chosen life. It was Quentyn, not Arianne, who had first pressed for this great march north. He believed that Dorne must do more than just survive. It must shape the fate of Westeros. And if those frozen terrors were real, then he would see them destroyed before they could set foot in the south. Arianne, older by a few years but no less determined, stood beside him, united in purpose. Where Quentyn was deliberate and stoic, Arianne was fiery, speaking her mind in bold words that carried the weight of her lineage. Neither questioned the other's motives. The threat made them set aside sibling rivalries. They called upon every ally, old or new, forging a promise that this time Dorne would be neither overlooked nor overshadowed. The desert rose would bloom in the snow if that was what it took to keep the realm free of the undead scourge. For weeks, the Dornish roads, thick with red dust, resounded with the tread of soldiers assembling in Sunspear. Bronze helms glinted in the sunlight, scarlet banners bearing the golden spear and sun rippled in the salt-scented wind that blew off the Sea of Dorne. Thousands upon thousands answered the summons of the Martells, filling the city to bursting. Courtyards and inns overflowed with armed men sleeping on pallets of straw, sharing salted olives, fresh goat cheese, and watered-down wine. As they marched through the wide streets with columns of spearmen, archers, and lightly armored cavalry, the populace showered them with rose petals, though petals in Dorne rarely matched the vivid red ones of the Reach. Instead, they were desert flowers in oranges and yellows, bright as the sun overhead. Before the departure, a grand blessing was held in the water gardens. Children, oblivious to the storm of war, played in the shallow reflecting pools, splashing in the water as their laughter rang against the colonnades. The priests of the seven offered prayers to the warrior for strength and skill in battle, to the father for justice, and even to the stranger that he might pass them by in the coming confrontation. Some also prayed to the old gods of the Rhoyne, whispering in a language that once rang through the river cities across the sea, or even to foreign gods like Lawler for a spark of protective fire to keep back the relentless cold. In the spiritual swirl, it felt as though all the gods of men were coalescing upon this place, forging a silent pact to ward off the ancient evil. The day they set forth dawned crisp in the Dornish sense, meaning only that the breeze was tolerably cool before the sun rose high. At the city gates, Arianne and Quentyn, mounted on superbly bred sand steeds, led the vanguard. The prince and princess of Dorne, siblings turned unwavering allies, cut regal figures. Arianne's long dark hair was braided back, revealing the set of her jaw and the determination in her eyes. She wore a sleeveless surcoat over light armor, the crimson and gold cloak pinned at her shoulder. Quentyn's armor was more pragmatic, battered from past journeys, but polished anew. His face was solemn, his thoughts likely swirling with uncertainties about the unknown horrors they might face. Behind them rode Ser Demon Sand, the bastard of God's grace, a knight whose loyalty to Arianne was as unshakable as the dunes themselves. The fiery Ilaria Sand, reimagined here as unbroken by grief, rode with them as well, her bright gown exchanged for riding leathers, her eyes carrying both sorrow for the past and hope for the future. And among the retinue, the slender form of Tie-in Sand was present, a silent but keen observer who had set aside her poisons for steel. With banners snapping overhead, the Dornish host spilled out of Sunspear in orderly columns. The fortress city receded behind them like a memory of warmth and light, for ahead lay the uncertain road. If all went as planned, they would travel first to the Prince's Pass, bridging the gap through the red mountains that separated Dorne from the rest of Westeros. From there, they would strike northward, forging alliances, or at least making clear their intention to stand as protectors against a greater menace. Countless leagues of open road and the promise of cold and snow beyond anything a Dornishman had ever encountered lay ahead. The first days of the march felt almost joyful. The men who had never ventured beyond the deserts looked with wide-eyed curiosity at the changing geography once they reached the more temperate valleys to the north of the Red Mountains. There was camaraderie in cooking communal meals, in swapping tales around fires. They spoke of the rumored dragons that had come to Westeros, how they might help turn the tide against the dead. Some worried about the biting northern cold that was said to be unlike the mild desert nights. The few who had ever been beyond the reach described snow as a soft white blanket that could bury entire villages. The men marveled and jested, glancing at their thick cloaks of brown and black fur with uncertain gratitude. Yet, for the supply wagons, loaded with casks of Dornish red and spiced dried meat, no jest was made. This was serious. If the White Walkers existed, if the living dead truly marched with them, these provisions might make the difference between life and death during the bleakness of a northern winter. The further they traveled, the more they saw the roads filling with other armies gathering in the name of the living. Envoys from the Reach, the Stormlands, the Riverlands, all forging north. Men who had once been enemies found themselves riding side by side, exchanging wary nods of acknowledgement. All were overshadowed by the knowledge that houses, grudges, and petty feuds meant nothing if the legends were true. The real feud was against the darkness. When they reached the outskirts of the Reach, Arianne led her captains in negotiations, ensuring that the Dornish host could pass without friction. The memory of prior wars lingered, but necessity trumped old resentments. Lords who might once have been Dorne's enemies recognized the gravity of the threat. Even so, a flicker of tension simmered as they rode through lands that had once been scorched by Dornish raids in centuries past. Yet the men of the Reach welcomed them with guarded courtesy, some even trading salted pork and cheeses for exotic Dornish peppers and dates. The High Lords withheld their grander welcomes. Indeed, no time existed for lavish feasts with winter pressing in from the far north. A few smaller houses, however, opened their keeps just enough to let the Martell army shelter in the nights, exchanging stiff politeness and murmured gratitude. Quentyn and Arianne used these intervals to pen letters to King's Landing, to the Stark in Winterfell, to Daenerys Targaryen if she was truly in the north as rumors claimed. They offered alliance and sought counsel on how best to deploy the southern army once it arrived. It was no small task to coordinate war on a scale that spanned the length of Westeros. So many centuries of conflict had woven a tapestry of distrust, and now, in the span of a few months, each thread had to be reoriented to form one unified shield against the shadows. In the evenings, as Quentyn tapped pen to parchment, he felt the weight of generations on his shoulders. He would not fail. He could not. As they pressed deeper into the heart of the continent, they began noticing the climate shifting. The nights grew cooler, the wind sharper. Dornish soldiers who scoffed at the notion of real cold now found themselves bunching closer to the campfires at night. Foot soldiers complained that their joints ached from the chill, while the cavalry found their horses' breath steaming in the morning air. Occasionally, they even rode through light showers of rain that, to them, was already uncomfortably cold. Little did they know the true kiss of winter was still far off. A shadow of foreboding began to steal over the once jovial columns. The soldierly banter softened, replaced by anxious murmurings. Rumors traveled faster than the wind. An army of the dead had already broken through the northernmost defenses, entire villages left silent and lifeless. Walls of ice had collapsed, or so some insisted. Others claimed that the wall still stood but had been circumvented by dark magics. Whichever rumor was accurate, the news that the undead had spilled across the north was enough to tighten every man's grip on his spear. The watchers around the camp grew more vigilant. At night, some prayed to the Seven. Others whispered words to the old Rhoynar gods or to the desert spirits they believed had protected Dorne for centuries. Many simply stared at the dark horizon, feeling as though death itself lurked just beyond the flickering perimeter of their fires. At an inn near the Rose Road, Quentyn crossed paths with lords from the Stormlands who spoke of sightings, White Walkers gliding through the forest at night, silent as ghosts, leaving frost upon the leaves. The dread in the Stormlord's eyes was enough to make Quentyn's heart pound. He and Arianne quietly conferred, setting a faster pace for the army's march. The sooner they reached Winterfell, if Winterfell still stood, the sooner they could stand with the other defenders. The living would need every spear, every sword, and every grain of courage. Despite the urgency, the journey took many more weeks. Wagon wheels broke, slowing their progress. Rains turned roads into sludgy mires. At times, in the narrow passes through the hills, the wagons threatened to overturn if the drivers were not careful. All the while, the temperature dropped degree by degree, teasing at the notion of the winter's cruelty that lurked beyond. Some of the men began to question whether it was wise for a desert people to venture so far from home into such unknown perils. Yet neither Quentyn nor Arianne would abide cowardice. They spoke of unity, of honor, of the promise to defend Westeros, and most of all, of the unrelenting fact that if the North fell, then nowhere else would be safe for long. Finally, after crossing the fertile plains of the Reach and following the roads that swept by the outskirts of the Crownlands, they approached the neck. By then, the wind carried the unmistakable hint of frost. For the first time, the Dornish soldiers witnessed ground that froze at night. Thin sheets of ice crusted over puddles, and the men poked them with the tips of their spears to watch the fragile glass shatter. A light snowfall drifted from pale gray skies, swirling like ghostly petals around the columns of riders. Many men gasped in wonder, having never seen snow. They reached out to catch flakes on their gloved hands, marveling as they melted on contact. But the marvel soon wore into wariness when the nights grew so cold that even their thick furs felt insufficient, and they woke in the mornings to find frost rimming their tents. Joints stiffened, supply wagons needed constant watch to ensure the provisions did not freeze. Even the wineskins were chilled to the point that drinking a sip felt like swallowing shards of ice. In these conditions, the Dornish host moved slower, but they pressed on. They traveled under the uneasy umbrella of an unrelenting sky. Gone were the bright southern suns. Here, the days were shorter, the gloom of the northern winter more pronounced. Quentyn found himself constantly riding up and down the lines, checking on the men's morale, distributing what precious warmth he could offer through encouraging words. Arianne did the same, her presence a spur to their courage. Although she too was shivering beneath her cloak, she refused to let it show. North of the neck, they began seeing refugees, small folk trudging southward with carts laden with what meager possessions they could salvage. Some had families in tow, others traveled alone, eyes hollow, cheeks thin from hunger. They muttered of the undead stalking the night, of farmland gone barren under an unearthly frost, of the cold that seeped into the bones like an incurable sickness. To see such misery both frightened and hardened the Dornish host. They began to understand that the stories of White Walkers were not mere tales. This was real. Death had indeed come. Arianne ordered that the refugees be offered some measure of food, if only a few loaves of bread and some salted olives. There was little else they could spare, not knowing how long their own stores must last. But more importantly, she and Quentyn gleaned information from these travelers. They learned that Winterfell was still standing, serving as a bastion for what remained of the armies in the north, but that daily skirmishes with the undead had cut off many routes. The White Walkers and their legions of whites now prowled further south than any living man had thought possible. The great houses Stark, Targaryen, Arryn, Royce were rallying to defend the region, but the battles were fierce and the knights brought terror beyond comprehension. Daunted yet unwavering, the Dornish pressed on until, at last, they beheld the snow-blanketed lands of the north. Vast stretches of white replaced the rolling green and the biting wind scoured the flesh. Where once farmland might have thrived, there were now fields covered in an icy shroud, bare trees standing like black skeletons against the pallid sky. They advanced slowly, the hooves of their horses crunching through layered snow. Scouts reported that a wave of undead had been sighted to the west, but so far the way to Winterfell remained passable if they moved quickly. As they neared the ancient seat of House Stark, the silhouettes of Winterfell's towers and walls emerged through the haze of falling snow. The castle loomed larger than any fortification in Dorne. Smoke rose from its chimneys, indicating the presence of many people within. The famed hot springs likely offered some respite, keeping the castle's walls warm enough to stave off the worst of the frost. Even so, Quentyn could see the lines of men patrolling the battlements, cloaked in fur, watchful for any movement on the horizon. Gargoyles of ice formed in the corners, giving the fortress a grim, otherworldly appearance fitting for a land besieged by monsters out of legend. A trumpet blast echoed from the walls as the Dornish host came into view. The gates opened and a contingent of northern riders approached, banners flapping in the wind. Among them flew the dire wolf of Stark on a field of gray and white, and by their side the dragon of House Targaryen in red on black. It was surreal to see the sigil of House Martell in such proximity to these northern and royal standards, yet in that moment it felt right. Fire and blood, ice and sand all converging to fight a war that dwarfed the petty squabbles of old. One of the riders stepped forward, revealing a woman with pale skin, regal poise, and braided silver-gold hair. Her eyes were violet, Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen, somehow both fearsome and fragile in her humanity. Next to her was a man with dark hair and a solemn face, wearing black leathers and a cloak of white fur. His expression was resigned yet determined. Jon Snow, some whispered. The king in the north, the rightful Targaryen heir, or perhaps both. History had grown complicated, but the time for genealogical debates was lost in the face of the undead threat. Daenerys' voice, though softened by weariness, rang clear. "We welcome the warriors of Dorne." She inclined her head at Arianne and Quentyn. "Your presence brings hope that together we can end this nightmare." Jon Snow surveyed the desert warriors behind them, noting their numbers, their exhaustion, but also the unwavering resolve in their eyes. "You've traveled far." His voice was low, carrying the weight of many losses and too few victories. "I pray you have the strength to face what comes next." Arianne bowed. "We've come to join your cause, your grace. Dorne stands with the North and with all living." Quentyn nodded, silently acknowledging that it was more than just words. He could feel the grit and determination radiating from his people. They would fight. They would bleed. They would die if necessary. This was no mere courtesy. This was a vow. Their arrival sparked a flurry of activity within Winterfell's walls. The keep was bustling with soldiers from all corners of Westeros, Stormlanders huddling in corners trying to shake off the cold, men of the Vale wearing layers upon layers of cloaks, Black Brothers of the Night's Watch standing stoically, and Unsullied who moved with quiet discipline, their exotic bronze spears gleaming in the torchlight. Dragons, it was said, roost in the fields outside the castle, though the white sky and swirling snow made it difficult to spot them until one heard a distant roar echo across the frozen plains. Scarcely had the Dornish begun to unload their wagons when Arianne and Quentyn were called to council. In the great hall, fires burned bright, though even that was not enough to banish the chill seeping through the stone. Jon Snow and Daenerys presided over the gathering. Advisors lined the edges of the long table, Tyrion Lannister with a calculating gaze and sharp wit, Ser Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight who wore both wisdom and humility on his sleeve, and Sansa Stark, a figure of northern grace and perseverance. Lords from other regions were present too, all circled around maps pinned under heavy stones, marking the areas where the White Walkers had been sighted. Dozens of colored markers represented allied armies or rumored enemy movements. "The dead have been pushing south in multiple columns," Jon said, pointing to specific points on the map. "We've had some successes, but each victory costs us dearly. We lack enough dragonglass weapons to equip everyone. The dragons help, but the Night King, the White Walker commander, has ways to counter them now. We believe he may have taken one for his own." At that, a ripple of fear and astonishment went through the council. Quentyn's face went pale. A reanimated dragon seemed a nightmare beyond imagining. Yet the truth was there in Jon's eyes. Daenerys spoke quietly, her voice tight with suppressed grief. "Viserion. He fell during an expedition north of the wall. Now he serves them. We must be prepared." Ariane exchanged a look with Quentin, remembering Dorne's own experience with dragons centuries ago, how the Martells had once resisted Targaryen conquest by cunning and subterfuge. But now dragons stood as their allies. Or at least 2 living dragons did. One was now an undead abomination bound to the White Walkers. "How can we stop it?" she asked softly. Jon shook his head. "We've discovered that dragonglass and Valyrian steel can kill White Walkers. Fire can stop whites. For the undead dragon, that is a harder question. My sister, Arya, once brought down a white giant with a well-placed dragonglass spear, but a dragon is another matter entirely." Daenerys' eyes flickered with a mixture of sorrow and anger. "We'll find a way. Rhaegal and Drogon have proven they can hold their own in the skies, but the Night King's powers are formidable. He can hurl spears of ice. One fatal strike and we risk losing another dragon to his side." Quentin leaned forward, bracing his hands on the edge of the table. "Then we must ensure your dragons have the best support we can muster. You speak of dragonglass. Dorne has none. But we have spears, thousands of spears, and skilled archers. If we must, we'll stand as your ground forces, shield your flanks, and let the dragons do their work." Tyrion nodded thoughtfully, eyes flicking over the Dornish siblings. "Your arrival bolsters our ranks considerably. But understand this, many men from southern lands freeze or fall ill simply marching in these conditions. When the real battles begin, the weather alone can be a lethal foe. We've prepared as best we could," Arianne said firmly. "But we will need guidance from the Northerners. We're not too proud to learn." Sansa Stark's gaze softened. She could see the sincerity in Arianne's eyes. "We will teach you," she promised. "We only ask for your fortitude. The battles ahead will test every last one of us." It was decided that the Dornish would occupy a swath of the castle grounds and the outskirts, creating a line of defense that would extend from Winterfell's western flank. In the coming days, smaller-scale engagements were expected as the undead probed the fortress's defenses. Scouts indicated a large horde moving through the Wolfswood. If the White Walkers were clever, and they might attempt to encircle Winterfell or cut off supply lines, isolating the fortress. Coordination with the Vale men and the Unsullied became paramount. The Vale Knights would likely take the eastern approach, where the mountainous terrain mirrored their home. The Unsullied, highly disciplined and unafraid to hold their ground, would form a bulwark at the main gates. The Dornish, with their famed agility and lethal spear tactics, would reinforce the more open flanks, using cavalry to ride down any whites that tried to slip past in the darkness. Quentin and Arianne saw to it that their men settled into a routine quickly. Campfires sprang up on the snowy courtyard, surrounded by men huddling in their cloaks, warming their hands. There was little space within Winterfell itself, so most had to endure the cold outdoors. The thick stone walls offered some shelter from the wind, but it was still a frozen realm to these desert dwellers. Some men coughed from the chill, others rubbed ointments into their chapped lips. Still, the Dornish grit shone through. They adapted, layering on every scrap of fur or cloth they had, focusing on the cause that had drawn them here. They would do their duty. Training sessions began in the courtyard, guided by Northern Rangers and members of the Night's Watch who had the most experience fighting the Whites. Wooden practice swords were swapped out for dragonglass daggers or steel lined with dragonglass shards. Practicing with such different weaponry proved awkward for many Dornish soldiers accustomed to curved blades or longer spears. But day by day, they improved, learning to aim for the vital points that would shatter the magic animating the undead. As the days passed, the sky darkened further as though the clouds themselves were thickening in dread. Patrols encountered small bands of whites lurking in the forests. Occasionally, a White Walker would appear at the edge of a clearing, its tall, lithe form bearing a spear-like shard of ice before melting away into the gloom. A few skirmishes left dozens of corpses in the snow, but the men realized with horror that their foes did not remain dead unless struck with the right weapons. The nightmares grew more vivid, men waking in the night with visions of those icy eyes. One evening, not long after the Dornish arrived, a piercing horn blast echoed through the winter air. The watch on the ramparts shouted warnings, bells rang. Torches flared to life, painting the white drifts orange and sending waves of shadows dancing across the courtyard. The dead were approaching in force. A sudden hush spread through the camp, broken only by the frantic clang of arms as men seized their weapons. Arianne and Quentin, already clad for war, rallied their captains. They dashed along the battlements, looking out across a snowy plain illuminated by a faint moon. There, beyond the flicker of braziers, a mass of dark shapes advanced at a slow, relentless march. The Whites. A legion of them, their silhouettes trembling and indistinct as though night itself had come alive. Behind them, though it was difficult to see, loomed taller figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. White Walkers. Quentin's throat tightened. No matter how many rumors he had heard, seeing it with his own eyes was different. The scale, the sheer number of the undead, was enough to chill the blood more thoroughly than any northern wind. A horn call sounded again from the direction of the dragons. A second later, a roar tore through the night sky. Flames lit the horizon, a streak of orange and yellow as Drogon, largest of Daenerys' dragons, soared upward. Regal followed, his green scales catching the moonlight. The watchers on the wall cheered, the sound tempered by underlying fear of the reanimated dragon that might be out there too. Word spread in the Dornish camp they were to hold the western flank. A mounted force under Ser Demon Sand would sweep wide and strike the edges of the undead horde, trying to prevent them from encircling the fortress. The rest would form lines along a hastily constructed barricade of sharpened stakes placed earlier in anticipation of an assault. Archers were to stand behind the stakes, protected, firing dragonglass-tipped arrows into the advancing ranks. Spearmen, each carrying a weapon with a dragonglass point, waited in tense silence, breath pluming in the frigid air. Arianne and Quentin took their positions at the center of the line. Above them soared the Martell banner, the sun spear, fluttering in a wind that carried the stench of decay and the echo of unnatural moaning. Torches were spaced at intervals, but they seemed feeble against the all-encompassing darkness. Somewhere to the east, horns signaled that the Unsullied stood ready, stoic as statues. Then, with a tremor in the earth and an unholy chorus of shrieks, the Whites came crashing forward. The first wave slammed into the spikes, the sharpened edges skewering ragged corpses. But more clambered over their own impaled kin, uncaring of their limbs torn and twisting. Archers let loose volley after volley, the dragonglass arrowheads flaring with a faint shimmer. Some Whites dropped, their magic undone. Others pressed on. The horde was vast. A shout rose from the Dornish lines, and the spearmen braced. The first rank of undead tumbled past the spikes, and the Dornish met them with thrusting spears. Quentin, near the center, felt his arms shake with impact as he impaled what once might have been a Northman. The thing's eyes glowed icy blue, jaws snapping until the dragonglass destroyed the necromantic spark in its skull. Quentin wrenched his spear free with effort, stepping back as the next wave staggered forward. Blood pounded in his ears. He'd fought men, mercenaries, and even contended with half-trained dragons in Essos. But these foes were mindless. They did not feel fear or pain. The press of bodies was suffocating. Arianne fought nearby, her hair whipping loose from its braid. She wielded a slender sword with a dragonglass edge that an armorer in Winterfell had fashioned. Her face was set, furious yet focused, as she parried the clawing hands of a White, spun, and drove her weapon through its rib cage. The monster collapsed into a heap, but 3 more lurched to take its place. She let out a cry, urging her men forward. To their credit, the Dornish lines held. Their discipline, forged in the scorching desert, translated now into a dogged, vicious stand. Every soldier knew that to falter was to die. When limbs threatened to freeze from the cold, they forced them to move. When fear gnawed at their courage, they thought of Sunspear's sun-warmed towers, of the children in the water gardens, of the olive groves and sweet citrus blossoms that would be forever lost if they failed. And so they thrust their spears, hacking down White after White, refusing to give an inch. Above, the sky erupted with fire as Drogon and Regal spat flame upon the undead ranks. A rush of orange light spilled across the night, illuminating the battlefield. Screams of burning Whites reverberated, a sickening hiss that turned to ash. Yet in that inferno, slender silhouettes of White Walkers emerged unscorched. Their ice weapons glinted with malevolence. One of them hurled a spear of ice at Regal. The dragon twisted in midair, the spear narrowly missing his flank. The watchers from below gasped at how close it had come. The undead horde, bolstered by the White Walkers' unearthly presence, surged again. The flanks threatened to buckle. Ser Demon Sand led the cavalry around the western rim, charging into the Whites' flank, trampling through them in a frenzied push. Horses screamed, men shouted. He brandished a sword with dragonglass inlay, slicing at skeletal forms that reached to drag him from the saddle. The impetus of his charge carved a bloody path, But soon the unstoppable swarm surrounded him and his riders. Demon's voice echoed on the wind as he yelled for them to keep moving, not to let themselves be pinned down. Quentin saw the threat. With a cry, he signaled for his second line of spearmen to pivot. They angled their weapons outward, forming a barrier to protect Demon's embattled riders when they broke free. Meanwhile, the outer edge of the barricade threatened to collapse under the press of cadavers. Men fell to the ground, Whites ripping at them with bony fingers. Screams reverberated. A few courageous Dornishmen leapt forward to drag their wounded comrades back behind the line, but those taken by the Whites were lost. Hours seemed to pass in a frenzy of blood, ice, and flame. In truth, the onslaught might have lasted only half an hour. The Whites had no sense of self-preservation, no fear, and they battered the living ranks with a seemingly endless wave. And yet, little by little, the defenders held. Dragonglass weapons destroyed the Whites by the dozen, and the dragon's fire consumed them by the score. The scorching light of living flame clashed with the unholy chill. In the process, the courtyard and fields before Winterfell became a charnel ground, littered with the corpses of men and monsters alike. At last, as dawn tinged the horizon with gray, the dead began to retreat. Or perhaps they were called back by the White Walkers for reasons of their own. Jon Snow, from another section of the battlefield, pressed them from the rear with combined forces of Northmen and Unsullied, cutting off large swaths of the White Host. Daenerys circled overhead on Drogon, unleashing gouts of flame to corral the undead. The second wave never came. Seemingly, this was only a probing attack. A test. But if it was a test, it had cost the defenders dearly. When the dead withdrew into the ice-laden forests, a strange silence fell across the field. The wind whistled mournfully, and the moans of the dying cut to the quick. Men in the Martell ranks slumped to their knees, exhaustion overwhelming them. Bodies lay heaped 3 or 4 high in places. Broken spears jutted from battered ground. The once pristine snow was churned black and red with gore. Some survivors sobbed in relief or despair. Others simply stared, hollow-eyed, at the drifting flakes of snow tinged pink by the morning's first light. Arianne, panting, surveyed the lines, numb with shock at the carnage. She saw Quentin standing a few yards away, leaning on his spear, his armor splattered with dark stains. Their gazes met. Neither needed words. This was the future if they did not end the threat, an unending tide of horror. They had survived a single night. Far worse nights likely lay ahead. In the hours that followed, the living tended to their wounded, carried the dead to funeral pyres, an absolute necessity, for any corpse left unburned might rise again if touched by the White Walker's dark magic. The stench of burning flesh was a foulness that no man or woman could escape. Yet they had to endure it for the sake of preventing the enemy from turning their own fallen against them. Among the casualties were many Dornish knights whose names had been known in Sunspear. Men who once laughed and drank under the scorching sun were now returned to the dust of the world in a foreign land. Though battered, House Martell's forces had stood firm. They had proven their worth to the northern cause. That same day, Arianne and Quentin attended another war council. The tension in the hall was palpable. Angry red wheels crossed men's faces from frostbite, arms were in slings, and bandages spattered with blood. Daenerys' expression was grim and Jon's was carved from stone. Tyrion paced restlessly, muttering about supply lines. Sansa and Arya, both present, looked determined but visibly haunted by the events of the night. "We lost 100 men at least," Jon said quietly, looking around. "Perhaps more once the final counts are made." The other flanks suffered equally. "But we stopped them here." "They'll return," said Davos, his gruff voice filled with fatigue. "Perhaps not tonight or tomorrow, but soon. The dead do not need rest." "We do." Daenerys, eyes flashing, said, "Then we cannot wait for them to overwhelm us. We must act. Perhaps we should consider a more direct strike. If we can kill the Night King." Easier said than done, Quentin thought but did not voice it. He remembered the White Walker's fluid, dangerous power, and the possibility that the undead dragon might appear at any moment, turning the sky itself into a battleground of ice and fire. Arianne stepped forward. "What if we draw them out? Force them to commit their main host? The dragons might strike at the heart of their army while an elite force, men armed with Valyrian steel, hunts down the Night King. If we succeed in destroying him, the Whites might collapse." Tyrion pursed his lips. "It's a plan that's been considered. The risk is enormous. If we commit our forces and fail, we lose everything in one stroke. Yet if we remain here indefinitely, Arian said, we'll be whittled down. We saw the losses from a mere probing assault. The next one might be thrice as large. All eyes turned to Jon and Daenerys. The union of ice and fire, as some had begun to call them. Jon, wearing sorrow like a second cloak, spoke quietly. I've faced the Night King before. He's cunning. He sets traps. But if we wait for the perfect moment, we may never act until it's too late. Daenerys nodded. I will not cower behind walls while the dead roam free. We have 2 dragons. They are a precious advantage. We must use them before the enemy's own dragon can tip the scales. Let them chase me and Drogon if they wish. Rhaegal can carry someone else, someone with the skill to deliver the killing blow. A silence fell. Riding a dragon was no easy feat. Jon glanced away, the burden clearly upon him. But Quentyn, remembering his own brush with dragons in Essos, spoke up. I may have some experience with dragons, though it nearly killed me. But I am willing. Jon measured him, eyes flickering over the scars on Quentyn's arms. We'll discuss it. First, we need more intelligence. We'll send out rangers to track the dead's movements. Then we'll decide how best to act. So it was agreed. For several nights, the Dornish stood ready. The White Walkers, however, kept their distance, withdrawing into the swirling mists of the far north, leaving the battered defenders to fortify Winterfell as best they could. Scouts returned with conflicting reports. Some claimed the dead were amassing to the west, others insisted they'd be assaulted from the east. The aura of dread hung over the fortress like a funeral shroud. Meanwhile, Quentyn found himself conferring with Daenerys, sometimes even joining her as she inspected her dragons. Drogon, colossal and fierce, bared his teeth at any who approached too closely. Rhaegal, smaller but still imposing, seemed to tolerate Jon's presence with a certain cautious acceptance. The conversation always circled back to the same question, how to kill the Night King. If they could end him, perhaps the entire undead legion would crumble. Ancient legends hinted that those creatures, the others, were bound inextricably to their maker's power. In the quiet of a torchlit courtyard, Quentyn tested a slender spear tipped with Valyrian steel. We have only a handful of these weapons, he murmured. Most of our men only have dragonglass, which is brittle. If it comes down to a single thrust, we cannot afford to miss. Dean. Rhys tilted her head. If you or Jon can face him from Dragonback, you may get one chance. Perhaps that is all we need. Her eyes flicked to Drogon, who lay curled in the snow, exhaling smoke from his nostrils. But be warned, the Night King can cast spears of ice that can bring down a dragon in a single strike. The memory of that near miss flashed through Quentyn's mind. He forced down the surge of fear. We will be ready, he said, though inside he felt anything but certain. Days passed, bleak and endless. Snow fell almost constantly, blanketing the battlements, forcing men to shovel paths across the courtyard. Rations were stretched thin. Every morning, crows flew out with messages to any lords who might still be able to send aid. A few small reinforcements trickled in from the Vale, from the Riverlands, but it was never enough to offset losses. Then, at last, word came from scouts that the undead host, led by the Night King himself, was converging to the west near the ruins of a long-abandoned holdfast. The sightings included a monstrous shape in the sky, a dragon with rotting flesh and ice-blue eyes. The decision was made. If the dead would not come to Winterfell, then the living would go to them. They could not allow an even larger host to gather. Better to strike while some measure of advantage still remained. The plan was risky, some would say reckless, but there was no alternative. The combined forces of the North, Targaryen, and Martell armies would march west, meet the undead host on terrain that, while still cold, offered fewer opportunities for ambush. The Vale Knights would provide cavalry from the hills, the Dornish cavalry would strike from the flanks, and the Unsullied and Northmen would form the backbone. Dragons would rule the skies, or die trying. And so, once again, the Dornish found themselves marching, though not as far. They traveled perhaps 2 days' ride from Winterfell through endless snowdrifts until they reached the chosen field. It was a broad expanse dotted with low hills and a scattering of withered trees. A broken holdfast, walls partially collapsed, stood like a silent sentinel in the center. The army deployed at dawn, forming ranks while the dragons circled overhead. Quentyn rode near the front, the spear with a Valyrian steel tip clutched tightly in his hand. Arianne commanded the spear phalanxes. Her face was a mask of resolve, but underneath, Quentyn knew her heart was pounding as fiercely as his own. They waited in tense silence, the hush broken only by the breathing of horses and the soft chink of armor. Clouds overhead blocked the sun, casting the battlefield in a dull gray light. Then came a tremor beneath their feet, a distant rumble. On the horizon, a shadow appeared, swelling as it approached. The ground seemed to quake with the force of the dead's march. An army of thousands, tens of thousands, emerged into view, ranks of skeletons and corpses shambling forward, eyes alight with cold hunger. At their forefront rode white walkers upon dead horses. Above them soared the undead dragon, its wings tattered but strong, trailing ribbons of frost in its wake. There was no grand speech this time, no time for bravado. As soon as the whites came within range, Daenerys spurred Drogon into a soaring dive, unleashing a torrent of flame. Rhaegal followed, with Jon clinging to his scaled back. A thunderous cheer rose from the living ranks, only to be drowned out by the shrieks of burning dead. The White Walkers scattered momentarily, but the undead dragon responded, turning its milky eyes skyward. With a roar, it spewed a blast of icy breath, meeting Drogon's flame in midair. The collision of elements created a violent explosion of steam and shards of ice that rained upon the battlefield. Soldiers raised their shields, crouching to avoid the razor-sharp debris. Under that veil of steam, the whites surged. The living braced. Dornish spears met the undead tide with brutal efficiency, each thrust seeking to sever the necromantic cord animating those husks. Northmen and Unsullied fought side by side, each lending strength to the other. War horns sounded on both flanks as cavalry from Dorne and the Vale crashed into the mass of rotting flesh, carving bloody swaths, though many riders fell to grasping hands that tore them from the saddle. Amid the chaos, Quentyn saw a flank faltering where a White Walker led a group of whites with terrifying speed. He spurred his horse forward, brandishing his Valyrian-tipped spear. The walker noticed him and turned its icy gaze, raising a jagged blade of pure ice. Quentyn urged his mount faster, heart hammering. The distance closed. The White Walker seemed almost curious, as though deciding how best to kill this mortal. Quentyn let out a wordless cry and thrust his spear. At the last second, the creature deflected the blow with unnatural grace, the tip scraping across its chest but not fully piercing. Frost crackled where metal met ice. The walker brought its blade down, grazing Quentyn's shoulder and sending a chill through his bones that felt like death itself. He almost dropped his spear, but adrenaline carried him through. He wrenched the reins, circled back, and stabbed again. This time, the tip struck home. The walker let out a shriek like a winter gale. For an instant, its entire body seemed to crack, spiderweb lines coursing through its icy flesh. Then it shattered, exploding in a burst of crystalline shards. The whites nearby staggered, momentarily disoriented, and Quentyn's men swarmed in, destroying them before they recovered. But victory against one walker was not enough. The undead dragon roared overhead, engaged in a savage aerial duel with Drogon and Rhaegal. Streams of icy breath clashed with living flame. Battered by ice, Rhaegal spiraled downward, smashing into the ground with a thunderous impact. Jon was thrown clear, landing hard in the snow. Immediately, whites converged on him. Quentyn, seeing this from a distance, kicked his horse into a gallop, signaling a group of Dornish cavalry to follow. They tore through the ranks of the undead, clearing a path to Jon's crumpled form. He was alive but dazed, struggling to rise. Quentyn dismounted, hauling him to his feet and forcing a dragonglass sword into his hand. Back to back, they fought off the surge of whites. Overhead, Rhaegal roared, battered but still alive, snapping at any undead that ventured too close. Then the temperature plummeted even further. A hush seemed to steal over the battlefield, as though all sound were muffled by swirling snow. Across the field, from the midst of the dead, a figure came into view. Tall, gaunt, wearing armor of ice, with eyes that burned blue. The Night King. He strode forward without haste, as if entirely certain of his victory, a spear of ice in his hand. Jon, face set like stone, pushed through the whites. Quentyn followed, determined to stand beside him. The undead parted for their master, allowing the confrontation. The plan had always been for Jon or someone else with Valyrian steel to strike the fatal blow. Yet the Night King radiated an aura of frost so intense that Quentyn's lungs seemed to freeze with every breath. The ground crackled, forming black ice that spread outward from the being's feet. Jon lunged with his sword of Valyrian steel, aiming to replicate the success at Hardhome. The Night King parried effortlessly, blade meeting blade in a shriek of ice against steel. Quentyn circled around, spear raised, looking for an opening. But the Night King moved with an uncanny fluidity, turning aside Jon's strikes, stepping backward when Quentyn thrust, as though anticipating every move. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he sent a wave of frost that slammed Quentyn to the ground. Pain lanced through his spine as he hit the ice-caked earth. Jon attacked again, teeth clenched. Their blades locked. The Night King's face a mask of malice. A swirl of snow enveloped them, so thick that Quentyn could hardly see. Summoning what strength remained, Quentyn struggled to his feet, ignoring the ache in his limbs. He raised the spear, trying to steady his shaking grip, creeping closer to the swirling white haze. Shapes moved inside the storm. Jon and the Night King locked in a lethal dance of steel and ice. Through a gap, Quentyn glimpsed an opening. The Night King's side was exposed for a split second. He hurled his spear with all his might. The weapon sailed through the air, Valyrian steel tip gleaming. At the last instant, the Night King twisted, the spear grazing his armor and spinning away, burying itself in the snow. With a spine-chilling hiss, the Night King slammed Jon's sword aside, hurling the man backward. Then he turned his gaze on Quentyn. 1 step, 2 steps, advancing, the ice spear raised. Quentyn scrambled to retrieve his thrown spear, but it was out of reach. The wound in his shoulder from earlier burned with the cold. He reached for a dragoglass dagger at his belt, but a wave of intangible frost pinned him in place. The Night King loomed over him, raising his weapon. A roar tore through the storm. Out of nowhere, Drogon descended, Daenerys perched atop, unleashing a torrent of flame that struck the Night King full on. The intense heat clashed with the frigid aura, creating a blinding explosion of steam. Quentyn shielded his face, every sense overwhelmed by scorching and freezing in the same instant. When his vision cleared, the Night King still stood, though his icy armor appeared to have cracked. With eerie calm, he flung the ice spear at Drogon, who twisted away, narrowly missing a fatal blow. The ground shuddered as Rhaegal rejoined the aerial assault, bloody but enraged. Jon, battered but alive, staggered back into the fray, grabbing a second Valyrian steel sword from the body of a fallen ally. Arianne appeared, leading a handful of Dornish soldiers who cut down whites attempting to protect the Night King. Together, they pressed their advantage, forging a path toward him. Snow and ash swirled in a mad, howling storm. The clang of steel, the shrieks of the whites, the roar of dragons, it all merged into chaos. Quentyn found his spear, yanked it free of the snow, then joined the attack. The Night King parried again, yet each strike, each blow, chipped away at his icy form. Flames from Drogon's breath flared close, forcing the ancient evil to step aside. In a moment of disorientation, the Night King faltered. Jon took his chance, driving the Valyrian steel sword deep into the creature's chest. A noise like shattering glass echoed across the field. Cracks radiated across the Night King's body, and in a final, defiant glare, he shattered into 1,000 shards of ice that dissolved into the wind. Time stopped. The whites, as one, froze in place. A heartbeat later, they collapsed. The entire undead host crumbled to dust and rotted flesh, unmoving, their unholy strings cut. A hush enveloped the battlefield, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Men stared at each other in disbelief. Was it truly over? The monstrous shape in the sky, the undead dragon, let out a keening roar, then, as though its magic tether had snapped, it crashed into the snowy field, thrashing for a moment before going still. The Night King was gone, and with him, the binding force animating the army of the dead. Silence. True silence. Quentyn sank to his knees, spear falling from numbed fingers. Arianne rushed to him, pressing her hand to the wound on his shoulder, tears mingling with relief. Jon stood over the broken ice, sword still in hand, Daenerys beside him on Drogon, Rhaegal landing nearby with a pained shriek. Across the field, men emerged from behind barricades, from the wreckage of war machines, all turned to gaze at the vanquished legion. No one dared to cheer yet. Their minds were still catching up to the realization that they might have won. The darkness that had threatened to consume Westeros for millennia had been undone by a few inches of Valyrian steel and the courage of mortal hearts. In a rush of emotion, the living let out cries of joy and disbelief. Some laughed, some wept openly, hugging each other amid the carnage. Fires still burned, melting drifts of snow. The stench of death lingered, and countless injuries and fatalities scarred the survivors. But the Great War, this horrifying war, was ended. The White Walkers were no more. Under that gray sky, with snow beginning to drift lazily once more, Arian held Quentin close, ignoring the sting of her own wounds. Around them, Dornish soldiers gathered, their spears lowered, tears freezing on their cheeks. They had marched north across half a continent to face an enemy of legend. Now, at unimaginable cost, they had triumphed. They had proven that the men of Dorne could fight and bleed and win in the ice as they did in the sun. For them, and for all the realms of men, dawn had broken over the darkest of nights. When they returned to Winterfell, battered but victorious, fires blazed in celebration. There was no lavish feast, supplies were too limited, but what little remained was shared freely. The living, exhausted and in mourning for the friends and allies lost, could still find solace in each other's company. The watchers on the walls gazed out at the quiet fields, no longer haunted by the shapes of the dead. For the first time in many nights, men laid down to sleep without fear that they would be woken by the horns signaling the next wave of the undead. In the days that followed, as the North began the long process of reclaiming its lands from winter's grasp, the Dornish prepared for the journey home. They had come for a cause that transcended ambition or vengeance. They had come for life itself, and in that crucible of battle, an understanding had formed between Dorne and the other regions of Westeros, forged in blood and honor. The grudges and slights of old wars seemed to pale in comparison to the memory of fighting side by side in the snow. Before they departed, Jon Snow, his wounds bandaged, face drawn but grateful, came to bid them farewell. Daenerys stood at his side, regal even in her weariness, her dragons roaring softly in the distance. "House Martell will not be forgotten," Jon said quietly. "What you did here will echo through the ages." Arianne inclined her head. "We only did what was necessary." Quentin, resting his injured shoulder in a sling, nodded. "If ever we are threatened by darkness again, you will find allies in Dorne. Our spears stand ready." Daenerys smiled, a genuine warmth in her violet eyes. "I never thought to find the desert sun in the heart of winter, but you brought light here." With that, the Dornish turned southward, carrying their wounded on litters, their hearts heavy with memories of fallen friends and the horrors they had witnessed. Yet they also carried a sense of pride and unity that had long eluded Westeros. They had marched north to battle the White Walkers, and they had emerged on the other side battered but unbroken. The pages of history would forever record the desert warriors who braved the ice to defend the living world. House Martell would ride home knowing that, for once, the sun and spear had cast its light not only for Dorne, but for every beating heart in the realm. In the end, as the host of Dorne descended back through the neck, crossing the familiar roads of the Reach and heading toward the Red Mountains, they carried with them the echoes of that final confrontation. The howls of the wind, the crackle of ice, the flash of Valyrian steel. They had proven that no matter the distance between scorching desert sands and frozen northern tundras, the living could unite when threatened by a darkness that cared nothing for their differences. And for all the tragedies, for all the sorrow, this victory stood as a beacon, a reminder that in the face of death itself, men and women could set aside ancient feuds and stand together. The White Walkers had been real, their threat unimaginably dire, but the realm had not fallen. Dawn had come after the longest night, and with it the promise that life would go on, that children yet unborn would live in a world without the terror of undead armies. As the towers of Sunspear came into view at the end of that long, arduous journey, the air grew warm again, carrying the scent of citrus blossoms. The men, still haunted by the memory of those blue-eyed monstrosities, felt relief wash over them in gentle waves of heat. This was home. The seat of House Martell, the land they had fought to protect even when the threat was 1,000 leagues away. As they passed through the gates, rose petals, orange and gold, the colors of the desert bloom, fell from balconies. The city rang with shouts of welcome, of gratitude. Word had spread that the Great War was over, the White Walkers defeated. For Dorne, this was a time to rejoice and to honor the valiant. Quentin and Arianne, though tired and forever changed by what they had seen, could not help but be moved by the sight. Their people, safe under the southern sun, cheered them like conquerors returning from a distant battlefield. Inside the halls of Sunspear, the water in the fountains danced in bright sunlight. Children chased each other around the columns, unknowing of how close the world had come to eternal night. Ariane found a moment of peace as she knelt by one of those fountains, letting the cool water flow through her fingers. Quentin stood beside her, silent in thought, each of them recalling the lines of fire and ice that had transformed them. They exchanged a look that spoke more than words. They had done their duty, and their land was free to prosper under the sun's warmth. Even as life returned to its gentle rhythms in Dorne, no one would forget the unity forged in snow and blood. Treaties were strengthened, trade routes reopened, and in the years to come, stories were told of the day the Martell host marched north to face the White Walkers. The children of Sunspear would grow up hearing tales of spears tipped with dragonglass, of dragons battling in the sky, of a swirl of snow and flame where the fate of the realm was decided. The story would pass from generation to generation, a reminder that bravery is measured not by the heat of one's homeland, but by the fire in one's heart. And so, in that time of rebuilding and reflection, the banners of House Martell fluttered proudly in the Dornish wind. No longer were they content to remain in the far south, isolated by their deserts and mountains. They had joined the realm in the greatest trial men had ever faced, had proven that Dorne's will and spirit could burn bright enough to ward off even the coldest darkness. The memory of that single, impossible victory would endure long after the last embers of funeral pyres had cooled, showing that when the living stood as one, even the ancient terrors of winter could be defeated. And in the hush of dawn, with the sun rising over the dunes, casting warm light across Sunspear's walls, one could almost believe that the world had been granted a new beginning thanks, in part, to the spears and courage of Dorne. One could almost believe that the world had been granted a new beginning thanks, in part, to the spears and courage of Dorne. Yet, if there was a single truth learned in the aftermath of the Great War, it was that endings were rarely as simple or as final as the songs would have men believe. The White Walkers had been shattered, their undead armies dissolved into lifeless husks, and the Night King was no more. Even so, the living now faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding their war-torn realm. Winter lingered in the north, its chill still strong, though some subtle shift in the air suggested that this bitter season might not last forever. Over the next few weeks, House Martell's forces busied themselves tending to their wounded, offering what supplies they had left to help feed the battered folk around Winterfell, and carefully preparing for the long trek south. The castles and homesteads of the north had taken a fearful beating, entire villages along the outskirts lay in ruins, and the small folk who survived were gaunt, clinging to life with desperation. Though the Martells were eager to return to their sun-kissed sands, none wished to abandon the north in its hour of need. In the first days after the battle's end, Quentyn Martell spent much of his time in the great courtyard of Winterfell, standing beside Rhaegal, the green dragon who had plunged from the sky in the final confrontation. Rhaegal nursed wounds across his flank, one wing-tip still scorched with bitter frost from the undead dragon's icy breath. While Daenerys Targaryen and her loyal retinue of dragonkeepers used salves and heated compresses to aid in the dragon's recovery, Quentyn stayed near, speaking to the wounded beast in low, soothing tones. He had, in Essos, once nearly lost his life attempting to tame dragons that did not recognize him as their master, and the scars of that past mistake lined his forearms. But here, alongside Daenerys and Jon, he found a strange kinship with the living flames these creatures embodied. Rhaegal tolerated him, allowing Quentyn a few steps closer each day without snarling or snapping. The fact that the dragon had not outright incinerated or devoured him was considered a blessing in and of itself. Still, he would never presume to claim the same bond that the Targaryens possessed. This was their birthright, and he was only a curious ally. Arianne Martell, for her part, continued to attend councils in the main hall, though the gatherings now concerned themselves not with dire threats from beyond the wall, but with something more delicate, the political future of Westeros. Daenerys and Jon shared an uneasy alliance, uneasy only in the sense that neither had truly envisioned themselves rulers before the war forced their hands. Jon, once proclaimed king in the north, had bent the knee to Daenerys to unite against the dead. Now that the threat was ended, there were questions among the northern lords whether the north would remain a separate kingdom or rejoin the larger realm under the Targaryen banner. Tyrion Lannister counseled that the old ties must be reforged. Ser Davos Seaworth noted that the north had spilled as much blood as any, and if Queen Daenerys had their loyalty, it would only be with mutual respect. Lady Sansa Stark remained somewhat guarded, not openly opposing Daenerys but weighing the interests of the north. Through it all, Arianne observed, spoke sparingly, and offered the Martell's perspective when asked. Dorne had long traditions of independence too, having once resisted the Targaryen conquest. But now, after fighting side by side to save the realm, she saw an opportunity for a unity that did not erase the distinct cultures of each region. She confided in Ser Davos one night by the fireside, telling him that Dorne would gladly see a Targaryen upon the throne so long as old wounds were not dismissed as trivial. If Daenerys wished to rule well, she would have to rule justly, remembering that all corners of the realm had their pride. The battered northern countryside served as a somber reminder that war leaves scars far beyond the battlefield. Streams had frozen over in the deep winter, farmland lay fallow, and any sense of normalcy was gone. Wagon caravans from the south, carrying food and supplies, became lifelines for entire settlements. Jon Snow, though clearly exhausted, personally oversaw the distribution of bread and salted fish in local hamlets. He never seemed to rest, dividing his time between aiding Daenerys' efforts to rebuild and reassuring his own people that he would not abandon them to cold or hunger. Now that the dead were gone, the realm's divisions, the old cracks in the foundation, began to reemerge, but at least for a time, most recognized that they could not afford to let petty rivalries supplant the alliances forged in blood. Arianne often rode out with small patrols of Dornish and northern men to see how the outlying regions fared. She wore a thick cloak lined with wolf fur, something she had initially balked at, but the chill had proved unrelenting, especially after sunset. On these excursions, she encountered terrified families living in half-collapsed barns or old men foraging for scraps of firewood where entire forests had been stripped bare by the passage of undead. It pained her to see such suffering, and she promised those she met that help would come. Whether that help would be from the Crown, the North itself, or from Dorne, she could not always say. But she let them know they were not alone. The empathy she felt reminded her that she'd once viewed the wars of the Seven Kingdoms as distant affairs, unconnected to the everyday survival of small folk. Now she understood that when great lords clashed, it was these folk who suffered the worst. The memory of the final battle against the White Walkers loomed over all of these men and women, as tangible as the storm-gray skies. Ellaria Sand, reimagined in these events as a fierce defender of Dorne's cause, worked alongside healers in the makeshift infirmaries scattered throughout Winterfell. Her knowledge of desert herbs for pain relief proved invaluable, though she found few equivalents among the winter plants. She had to adapt, learning from the maesters and the women of the north which roots and mosses could be boiled for poultices to treat frostbite and infected wounds. Though Ellaria had lost much in her life, her beloved Oberyn Martell among other dear ones, she moved through the infirmary with a quiet determination. She taught young northern girls how to steep teas that dulled pain, and in return, they showed her how to spin thick woolen blankets that might fend off the merciless cold for Dornish soldiers not accustomed to frigid nights. A small sense of communal solidarity grew from these exchanges. Each day, she prayed, in her own way, that no new wave of undead would come lurching from the shadows. The war was over, or so everyone kept repeating, but the dread of that final night still had not left her bones. More days slipped by, carrying with them the knowledge that soon, the Martells and their army must depart. Dorne had come to do its part, and now, winter or no winter, home beckoned. The Red Mountains would not be any warmer than usual when they arrived, but anything would be preferable to the biting freeze of the north. Yet, leaving was not as simple as packing up and departing at dawn. Treaty negotiations, discussions of new alliances, and Daenerys' vision of a reconstructed kingdom demanded that the lords who had risked the most be heard before they scattered to their distant seats. A great gathering was called in the Great Hall of Winterfell one final time. The banners of all present houses draped from the walls, House Stark's direwolf next to House Targaryen's dragon, side by side with House Martell's sun and spear, the crowned stag of Baratheon for those Stormland lords who had joined, the moon and falcon of the Vale. Lords and ladies from the Riverlands, the Reach, and what remained of the Crownlands were there too, though their numbers were fewer and many seats in the hall remained empty or occupied by newly raised lordlings whose predecessors had perished. The meeting took the better part of 2 days. Tension simmered in discussions about how to handle the Iron Throne, which had been contested in the south before the Great War began. Cersei Lannister was nowhere to be found, having vanished from King's Landing with her loyal retinue at some point. No one was entirely certain of her fate, only that rumors placed her in the Westerlands, possibly seeking refuge in the impregnable fortress of Casterly Rock. With no official queen sitting the throne in King's Landing and with Daenerys Targaryen anointed by many as the rightful monarch, a transitional period had begun. There were voices calling for a new coronation, but Daenerys refused to leave the north until she was certain winter would not claim more lives. Even so, she made it clear that she intended to sit the Iron Throne eventually, having secured alliances through her demonstration of valor in the Great War. The question then was how these alliances would form a new order. The Great Council debated the role of each region in this future. The North was the largest by land, battered by war but proud of its independence. The Vale was less devastated, having largely been spared by the dead, so its knights were still strong. The Stormlands had contributed a small force, led by lesser lords since no recognized head of Baratheon remained. The Reach was in flux, with House Tyrell extinguished and new families vying for the seat of Highgarden. Dorne, though far to the south, had proven its readiness to take action for the good of the realm. All these pieces had to fit together somehow, and the lords at Winterfell found themselves shaping the next chapters of Westerosi history. Arianne and Quentyn handled themselves carefully, speaking up for Dorne's unique position as a land that had joined the realm only after bloody wars and carefully negotiated marriage pacts centuries ago. They were not eager to lose any of Dorne's traditional liberties, nor were they inclined to press for more territory or special privileges. The Martells had lost many soldiers in this fight, but so had everyone else. When Tyrion Lannister, as Hand of the Queen, pressed them about trade agreements and taxes that might be levied to help rebuild the war-torn regions, Arianne did not hesitate to promise a fair share of assistance, so long as Dorne retained the right to manage its internal affairs without undue interference. She had not forgotten the atrocities visited upon Dorne in the past, nor the humiliations inflicted by certain Targaryen kings, but she believed Daenerys was a different breed of ruler, shaped by her experiences in Essos. A new pact might indeed be possible, one founded on mutual benefit rather than forced conquest. When the Great Council concluded, an accord of sorts was reached, a precarious, incomplete outline. Daenerys would soon journey south to claim the throne, but she would maintain the seat of her power in Dragonstone or King's Landing as circumstances required. Jon Snow would remain in the north as its warden, if not as an outright king, though some Northmen insisted on calling him such regardless. The Martells, in turn, agreed to pledge their swords and ships if any threat came from outside Westeros, be it from the Iron Islands under some new Ironborn warlord or from across the Narrow Sea. In exchange, Dorne's autonomy would be recognized. No more forced marriages or demands for hostages. The details were left for another time. Dorne was not about to sign a blank parchment for any monarch, but the principle of cooperation stood. Ties had been forged in a crucible of ice and blood, and no one wished to discard them lightly. At last, the day of the Dornish departure came. Snow still dusted the courtyard of Winterfell, though it was beginning to melt in patches as the days edged toward the latter half of winter. Soldiers of House Martell packed up their tents, stowed their gear on wagons, and prepared the hardy northern horses they had been using. Many men had lost friends and brothers in battle. Their faces were solemn. Others were anxious to return to the desert sun, to see their families and children, to sink their feet into warm sand instead of stumbling over ice. Quentyn and Arianne did not rush the preparations. They spent a final sunrise in the Godswood, its pond crusted with ice, the red leaves of the weirwood tree stark against the pale surroundings. There, amid the hush, they thanked the old gods or whatever gods might be listening, that they had survived a war that should have destroyed them all. Before departing, Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow came to bid them farewell at the gates, flanked by a small retinue. Tyrion stood off to one side, scribbling notes about supply lines and future correspondences, and Sansa Stark maintained a poised stance near the walls. Arya Stark lingered somewhere in the background, hooded and quiet. The dragons, Drogon and Rhaegal, soared overhead, their shadows crossing the snowy ground. The sight was both thrilling and sobering. Though the undead dragon had been vanquished, the memory of its horrifying presence still loomed in the minds of all who had witnessed it. Daenerys addressed Quentyn and Arianne with a genuine smile, though weariness dulled the brightness in her eyes. She thanked the Martells for their role in saving Westeros, and she assured them that they had made an ally in House Targaryen for all time. Jon added a few words of gratitude, though his manner was simpler and more reserved. A man of the North, unaccustomed to heavy praise or flowery courtesies, He merely took Quentin's hand and said, "We will not forget." Ariane replied that Dorn, too, would hold the memory of their northern brothers and sisters close. Finally, with horns sounding on the battlements, the long columns of Dornish soldiers began to file out of Winterfell, carrying with them the weight of triumph and tragedy alike. The march southward was a study in patience. Though the main threat had been ended, pockets of chaos lingered in the countryside. Some men who had lost everything in the fighting or the long night of terror turned to banditry, preying on smaller groups of travelers. Others were simply refugees, wandering in search of a new home. The roads were clogged with wagons, sometimes slowed by drifts of snow that had yet to melt. The Dornish caravan, numbering in the thousands, wove a careful path, offering aid where they could and chasing off any brigands foolish enough to challenge so large a force. Whenever they crossed paths with other returning armies, from the Vale or the Stormlands, they exchanged news of how the realm was settling. The Stormlanders spoke of a chaotic region still lacking a central lord. Some Baratheon cousins were pressing claims, but no one had emerged as a clear leader. Meanwhile, Knights of the Vale were eager to return to the Eyrie, their mountaintop seat presumably untouched by the undead, though winter storms made the climb perilous. Through it all, the Dornish maintained a steady pace, comforting themselves with the knowledge that each step brought them closer to the Red Mountains. In the Reach, the caravan encountered evidence of how swiftly war had changed everything. Major roads once well kept were now in disrepair, and some lesser castles stood deserted, their lords having marched north never to return. The farmland here was far more fruitful than in the cold wastes around Winterfell, but it looked neglected, as though no one had been around to tend it properly. Still, signs of spring were beginning to show, buds on the trees, patches of green grass under the melting snow, the occasional bird returning from warmer climes. It was as if the world itself was exhaling a long-held breath. Men in the columns brightened at the sight, removing their fur cloaks for part of the day, though nights remained chill. A few lesser lords of the Reach or their stewards approached the traveling Martells to discuss trade or glean further details about the Northern War. Word had reached them of the final victory, but rumor and exaggeration clouded the truth. Some whispered that all 3 Targaryen dragons had died. Others insisted Daenerys Targaryen was a sorceress who had banished the undead with one wave of her hand. Ariane and Quentin did their best to dispel wild tales, explaining that while the White Walkers were indeed destroyed, the realm now faced the challenge of rebuilding under Daenerys' likely queenship and that 2 of her dragons yet lived. In these conversations, the Martells refrained from any sign of arrogance. In ages past, Dorne might have gloated about its part or might have used the chaos to enact vengeance on old foes, but now the siblings understood that a future of cooperation would benefit them all far more than old grudges. So they answered the queries politely, shared what supplies they could spare, and marched on. After many days, the dusty roads of the Dornish marches came into view. The transition from the Reach's green rolling hills to the sun-scorched mountains and stony passes of Dorne was gradual but unmistakable. The columns began shedding layers of clothing during the day, swapping out thick furs for lighter fabrics stored in wagons. At night, though, the desert's chill still bit, reminding them that winter lingered in the world's bones. Nevertheless, spirits soared. The men sang Dornish ballads around the campfires, recalling their relief at being back on familiar ground. For some, the Red Mountains were a symbol of safety and pride. For others, they represented the gateway to home. Through craggy passes and high-walled canyons, the columns wound their way towards Sunspear. News of their imminent return spread through the region, carried by travelers and outriders. By the time they descended from the mountains and gazed upon the open deserts and the shining coastline of the Sea of Dorne, they were greeted with fanfare in every small settlement they passed. Women in bright veils and men in loose-fitting robes came out to wave colored scarves and toss blossoms under the horses' hooves. The returning soldiers felt an odd mix of elation and sorrow. Many marched home, but many others had fallen in the snows of the north, leaving empty saddles that would never be filled again. Sunspear rose before them at last, its towers and spires baked a golden hue in the desert sun. The city gates thronged with well-wishers, some who had heard of the Great War's end only in rumor, others who had daily prayed for the safe return of fathers, sons, daughters, and wives. A deafening cheer echoed off the walls when the Martell banners came into view. Ariane and Quentin, riding at the forefront of the procession, had tears in their eyes despite their attempts at a stoic facade. The gates swung wide, and in poured the army, welcomed by the scents of spiced wine, sizzling peppers, and fresh bread. Never had their home seemed so vibrant or so precious. Once inside, the soldiers spread through Sunspear's winding streets, reuniting with families or heading to the barracks to rest. Trumpets sounded from the tower tops, a clarion of celebration that mingled with the seabirds' cries along the coast. The water gardens at the outskirts of the city seemed to beckon them with the promise of cool pools and bright mosaics, a stark contrast to the bloodied snows they had left behind. In the palace of Sunspear, the servants moved about in a flurry of preparation. Word had come that a feast would be held in honor of the returning heroes, nothing too ostentatious, for supplies were still tight and the realm had many hungry mouths to feed, but enough to show gratitude for sacrifices made. Ariane, stepping through the familiar corridors, marveled at how the simple sound of her slippers on the mosaic floor stirred such deep emotions. She remembered the day they had left, the fresh determination in her step, the knowledge that they were marching to face some unimaginable horror. Now, the horror had been faced and her footsteps carried a subtle heaviness, the weight of experience. Even the sunlight through the high windows seemed different, warmer, yes, but also touched by the knowledge of how fragile peace could be. She paused at the wide archway overlooking the sea, letting the salty breeze wash over her. On the horizon, merchant ships bobbed, their sails bleaching under the sun. Life continued, commerce thrived, and Dorne endured. That evening, as twilight draped Sunspear in shades of bronze and pink, the palace's largest courtyard filled with the music of pipes and drums. Torches and lanterns illuminated the stone walls, casting flickering shadows across the intricately patterned floor. The returning soldiers and knights of Dorne gathered under tall date palms, while stewards and wine-bearers wove among them, offering cups of strong Dornish red and platters of roasted goat with olives and peppers. A tall dais had been erected at one end where the royal family of Dorne would greet the crowd. Though Ariane had essentially been ruling as Princess of Dorne ever since her father's declining health and subsequent passing, the memory of Prince Dor and Martell still lingered in the architecture of Sunspear. Quentyn stood by her side, his arm still in a sling from injuries sustained in the battle against the Night King's forces, while Ilaria Sand, Tyene Sand, and other prominent figures of the Martell household gathered close. The hush that fell when Ariane stepped onto the dais surprised her. She had expected excitement or cheers, but the crowd seemed to sense the solemn undertone that underscored the entire homecoming. Ariane cleared her throat and began speaking. Her voice carried well in the courtyard's acoustics. She welcomed all who had returned, offered thanks to the gods, whichever ones they believed in, for delivering them from the horrors of the undead. She spoke of unity, of how the men of Dorne had fought alongside Northerners, Stormlanders, and Targaryen forces, forging bonds in blood that might usher in a new era for Westeros. She honored the fallen, naming many knights and soldiers who would not return to their families. She thanked the small folk for keeping the home fires burning, for sending what supplies they could, for their prayers and their faith. When she finished, the courtyard erupted in applause, accompanied by a wave of emotion that left her heart pounding. This was not the triumphant greeting of conquerors returning laden with spoils. It was a moment of shared relief, a collective promise that they would not allow such a cataclysm to threaten their land again. Quentyn then took a step forward. He was never as comfortable with public speaking as his sister, but the crowd quieted once more in respect. Briefly, he recounted the final battles, how the Dornish spears had held the line at Winterfell's western flank, how cavalry had charged the undead, how so many brave souls had fallen to keep the living safe. He did not spare the grim details. He wanted the people of Sunspear to understand the magnitude of what had taken place, so that they would not take peace for granted. He ended by thanking Ariane for her leadership, turning to face her with a proud smile. The crowd broke into cheers again, accompanied by stamping feet and cries of Martell. Martell. And Ariane. Quentyn. The pounding of drums rose to fill the night. And so the feast began. Torches burned late into the dark hours, sending sparks into a star-filled sky. Musicians performed the lively rhythms that Dorne was known for, and dancers spun across the courtyard in swirling colors. Soldiers who had faced the cold terrors of the north found themselves loosening up with cups of spiced wine, swaying to the music as if determined to shake off the chill that had lodged in their bones. Some knelt at shrines to the Seven or to the Rhoynish river gods, offering silent thanks. Others told tall tales of monstrous wights that grew to twice the size of giants, or of dragons so fierce they could melt entire battalions. Here, in the warmth of Sunspear, these tales took on a heroic sheen, even if just days earlier they had been the stuff of nightmares. Ilaria Sand oversaw the distribution of food and blankets to the families of those who had died in the Great War, ensuring no one fell through the cracks of Dorne's generosity. Tyene Sand slipped through the crowd, listening for rumors or whispered concerns, whether about new threats from the Westerlands or the uncertain shape of the Iron Throne's future. Some men worried that Cersei Lannister might still muster an army from Casterly Rock, but others insisted that Daenerys Targaryen, with 2 living dragons at her side, would root out any resistance. Arianne heard bits and pieces of these whispers as she moved among her people. She shared words of comfort or resolve, telling them that Dorne would not be caught unprepared again, that an alliance with the Targaryens would ensure their borders remained secure. In the week that followed, the city of Sunspear settled into a new rhythm. Soldiers drifted back to their home castles or estates. Some found their families safe and well, others discovered heartbreak in the time they had been away. A few who had lost everything on the fields of the north came to Arianne asking for land or a pension in recognition of their service. She granted what she could, mindful of the realm's limited resources. Work crews were organized to repair the roads leading through the Prince's Pass, which had been damaged by storms and heavy use during the march north. Merchant ships docked in the harbor, bearing goods from Essos and the Narrow Sea, re-establishing the trade that had flagged while winter's threat loomed over the entire continent. In the marketplace, the bustling resumption of commerce lifted spirits, though the memory of warfare was still etched behind many eyes. Not long after their return, letters began arriving from the Crownlands. The first was penned by Tyrion Lannister himself, carrying news that Daenerys Targaryen had begun her journey south and intended to pause at several key castles along the way. Harrenhal, the ruins of which might be partially rebuilt to house the stream of refugees seeking shelter, and later the crossroads in Arya, where a new supply depot would be established. Jon Snow remained behind in Winterfell for the moment, guiding the north through the final stretch of winter, but was expected to join the Queen by the time she neared the capital. King's Landing itself was in an uproar. Some of Cersei's loyalists had either fled or been subdued. There was talk of pockets of resistance in the city, of the Golden Company's uncertain loyalties now that the Lannister coin had dried up. Tyrion's letter invited Arianne and Quentyn to come south. Indeed, to come to the capital for the coronation of Daenerys Targaryen as soon as it was secured and the city stabilized. Though no specific date was set, the tone of the letter was urgent. It was clear that Daenerys wanted the Martells to play a key role in the reestablishment of the royal court. Arianne read the letter by lamplight in the solar of Sunspear, her dark hair falling over one shoulder as she studied Tyrion's seal. Quentyn paced restlessly behind her, his eyes occasionally drifting to the scars on his forearms, as if each twinge reminded him of how complicated Targaryen affairs could become. For centuries, Dorne had fought and then negotiated with the Dragon Kings. They had married into Targaryen bloodlines, contended with them, resisted them, and finally joined them. Now, it seemed fate was drawing them together again. Arianne was not naive. She understood that Daenerys wanted alliances that would hold, and that Dorne's support would help legitimize her claim in the eyes of Southern lords. But she also sensed in Daenerys a genuine desire for friendship, or at least respect. The Queen had relied on the Dornish spears, and the Dornish had answered. Now, there was an opportunity to shape Westeros in ways that might benefit everyone, provided she and Quentyn could steer the negotiations skillfully. They sent a reply back to Tyrion, expressing gratitude for the invitation and willingness to attend. But Arianne requested time. Dorne had just begun to recover from the Great War, and while traveling to King's Landing was not a journey as long as the one to Winterfell had been, it would still be a substantial undertaking. She intended to bring an entourage befitting the status of Dorne, including knights, advisors, and a portion of the surviving captains who had led their men in the north. Moreover, she wished to coordinate with the other lords of Dorne, House Ironwood, House Dane, House Fowler, House Euler, House Jourdain, among others, so that no one felt excluded from the future shaping of the realm. The scars left by old rivalries within Dorne itself still ran deep. If she made the journey with only a small coterie, leaving other houses behind, it might be seen as a slight or a power play. In short, the Martells needed to show unity within Dorne before presenting themselves to the larger kingdom. In the meantime, life in Sunspear resumed a semblance of normalcy. Merchants hawked their goods in the bazaar, silks from Myr, spices from the Summer Isles, shining glass from Volantis. Street performers juggled and danced to the lively beats of hand drums. The harbor bristled with ships of all sizes, from swift dramans to broad-bellied trading cogs. Quentin often strolled along the docks listening to sailors' tales of how the news of the undead's defeat had spread across the narrow sea. Some scoffed at the entire notion, claiming it had been a grand Westerosi myth. Others believed wholeheartedly and praised the gods that the menace had been quelled before it could threaten Essos. A few rumored that the Red Priests of Lawlor in Volantis had prophesied the victory, that the Lord of Light had guided the flames. Quentin took these stories in stride. After what he had witnessed in the snows beyond the Neck, he no longer dismissed any possibility out of hand. Word of the Undead's end, however, did not quell every danger. Reports reached Sunspear that pirate raids had increased along the western coasts, emboldened perhaps by the uncertainty in King's Landing and the fracturing of the Old Order. These marauders harried small trading ships, occasionally landing on remote shorelines to plunder and burn. In response, Arianne ordered the construction of additional watchtowers along the coast of the Sea of Dorne and the Stepstones. She also commanded the Dornish Navy, limited though it was to dispatch patrols. A series of swift skirmishes erupted over the next few weeks as Dornish galleys clashed with pirate vessels near the disputed lands. Many a pirate found a watery grave, but the threat remained. Arianne wrote to Daenerys, informing her of these developments and suggesting that once the Queen was firmly on the throne, she might send the royal fleet to coordinate a larger crackdown. In these letters, Arianne strove to maintain the tone of a capable ally, neither desperate for help nor quietly harboring ambitions to rule the seas alone. As plans for the journey to King's Landing continued, Quentin delved into the archives of Sunspear, poring over old treaties and genealogies. If Daenerys truly meant to unify the realm, it would help to know precisely how Dorne's last marriage pacts with House Targaryen had been worded. Centuries ago, Princess Maria Martell had married King Daeron II Targaryen, sealing a union that ended the final hostilities of conquest. Terms of succession, titles, and tax rights had been spelled out in meticulous detail. Perhaps those old documents could guide the shape of a new alliance, ensuring Dorne's privileges remained intact while also forging something more modern. Often, Quentin would share his findings with Arianne over dinner in the Palace Solar, where open windows let in the mild evening breeze. They spoke long into the night, occasionally joined by Ilaria, Tyene, or other trusted counselors. The discussions ranged from minute legal points, how many hostages or wards might be expected at court, to broader questions: would Dorne push for a more equitable approach to governance? Could they help Daenerys avoid the same pitfalls that had plagued previous Targaryen kings? Meanwhile, rumors drifted in from King's Landing. The Golden Company, once in Cersei's pay, had fractured, with some Sellswords deserting to become outlaws while others apparently sought new contracts with the incoming regime. Daenerys had not yet reached the city, still pausing to secure various strongholds en route, ensuring no unexpected betrayals awaited her. Tyrion's letters indicated that the Queen was receiving homage from minor lords along the Crownlands, many of whom had grown weary of Lannister rule. In the Stormlands, some lords were forming new allegiances, eager for the stability that a Targaryen monarchy might bring. No one was certain exactly when Cersei would emerge to challenge Daenerys directly, if she was even in a position to do so, or whether she might attempt some last desperate stand at Casterly Rock. In short, the realm remained unsettled, the threat of civil conflict not yet entirely banished. Eventually, Arianne set a date for departure. 2 weeks hence, she would lead a delegation to King's Landing, accompanied by the heads or representatives of several major Dornish houses. The official purpose of their journey would be to witness and affirm Daenerys Targaryen's coronation once the city was stable enough for such a ceremony. Unofficially, the Martells would leverage their recent heroism in the north to ensure that, under a Targaryen restoration, Dorne's interests remained well protected. Aware that the roads were still fraught with uncertainty, she took no chances with security. She assembled a sizable escort of guards, knights, and cavalry, as well as a retinue of servants, healers, and even a few merchants eager to test the markets in the capital. The plan was to move methodically, avoiding any route rumored to be plagued by bandits or rebellious Sellswords. Arianne arranged for outriders to scout each day, and she tasked Quentin with overseeing logistics. He had shown a certain aptitude for managing the flow of supplies during the northern campaign. On the eve of their departure, as final preparations filled the corridors with a subdued kind of bustle, Arianne retired to her private chambers. The evening sky glowed with the last rays of sunlight, painting the domed ceilings and mosaic floors in soft gold. She settled by a low table, unrolling the map of Westeros she had used for planning the march north. Her gaze traced the route they had traveled to Winterfell, then the route back, and now she contemplated the path to King's Landing, one that would lead them from the blazing deserts of Dorne into the heart of the Seven Kingdoms. She could not ignore the sense of déjà vu. Once again, House Martell was making a risky journey for the future of the realm. But this time, she told herself, the threat was no longer an unstoppable undead horde. This was the familiar realm of politics, a different sort of battlefield, one where treachery and cunning could be as deadly as swords. She placed her fingertips on the map near the symbol representing King's Landing and took a measured breath. She remembered what it felt like in the Great War's final battle, the swirling snow, the clawing wights, the sheer terror as the Night King himself nearly cut Quentyn down. She remembered the stillness that followed their victory, how the wights collapsed into heaps of bone and rot. If they had been able to triumph over death itself, surely they could navigate the tangle of old grudges and fresh ambitions that awaited them in the south. And yet, a small voice in the back of her mind warned her that mortal men and women could be more unpredictable, more ruthless than any undead army. The Night King's evil had been inhuman, direct, unstoppable until that one fatal blow. But humans plotted in the shadows, changed alliances by the hour, and hid daggers behind honeyed words. She would have to be ready. When dawn arrived, the caravan set out under a sky streaked with vermilion. The heat of Dorne was already palpable, promising a day of dust and sweat. Arianne rode at the head, clad in breezy silks beneath light armor, practical enough for travel, yet still bearing the Martell colors. Quentyn was at her side, wearing his more weathered leathers and keeping a keen eye on the horizon. Behind them, the banners of House Ironwood, House Dane, House Fowler, and others fluttered in the wind. The procession numbered in the hundreds, a significant force, but not so large as to be unwieldy. They made their way through the winding roads of eastern Dorne, passing near the Green Blood River, whose banks were lined with orchards and vineyards. Children rushed to the roadside to wave at the passing lords and ladies, curious about the bustle. The caravan pressed onward day after day, crossing out of Dorne and into the Stormlands by way of the Bowway, then picking up the Rose Road that would eventually bend toward the Crownlands. Traveling through the Stormlands, they glimpsed the ravages left by earlier conflicts. Certain keeps still wore the scars of siege, blackened stone from wildfire or battered walls from catapults. War had moved swiftly across these lands in the recent years, Stannis Baratheon, then Cersei's forces, and now a period of tenuous calm overshadowed by the knowledge that Daenerys Targaryen was on the move. Some local lords regarded the Dornish travelers warily, but the presence of high-born nobles like Arianne assured them that this was no marauding army. Hospitality was offered in some keeps, though the supplies were meager. Arianne accepted graciously, ensuring that her people paid fairly for any goods they took. Diplomacy might begin with the smallest gestures, she reminded Quentyn one evening over a simple meal of black bread and salted pork. By showing respect to these lesser lords, House Martell could lay a foundation for the alliances they might need in the future. Word reached them that Daenerys had indeed pressed onward and was camped near Rosby, a day's ride from King's Landing. The city itself was in a state of high tension. Thousands of peasants and displaced folk had flocked there, seeking stability or merely the protection of city walls. Reports said that the Lannister banners still flew over the Red Keep, but that no one of note held real power. The Gold Cloaks, once loyal to the Lannisters, were in disarray. Some had thrown down their arms to await the Targaryen queen's arrival, others had locked themselves in barracks. The Tyrell seat of Highgarden remained under tenuous stewardship by House Hightower's lesser cousins after Lady Olenna's passing and the defeat of her line. The entire realm felt like a puzzle that Daenerys would attempt to solve upon being crowned. Arianne only hoped that the final pieces would not be drenched in blood. They reached the outskirts of King's Landing at dusk several days later, following the broad road that led toward the massive gates. Along the way, more refugees clustered in sad little encampments, cooking thin stews over smoky fires. The moment they spied the Martell banners, some looked fearful, memories of old hostilities died hard, while others cried out for bread or coin. Arianne ordered that small parcels of food be distributed from their wagons where possible, but it was clear they could not feed every hungry mouth. She sensed Quentyn's troubled gaze. The city had always been a place of extremes, where wealth paraded in the higher districts while poverty filled the slums of Flea Bottom. But the chaos of recent wars had only magnified this disparity. They pushed on, the wagon wheels grinding over rutted roads. The walls of King's Landing, enormous and daunting, loomed under the dusky sky. Torches glowed along the battlements, and the outlines of the city's 7 gates were barely visible. At the gate, one partially damaged as if an earlier skirmish Mish or riot had forced it. The caravan was met by a group of soldiers wearing black and red cloaks, Targaryen loyalists. Their captain, a stern man with a braided beard, stepped forward to greet Arianne. He informed her that Queen Daenerys was camped in the fields outside the city, preferring to assess the situation before entering the Red Keep. A wise choice, Arianne thought, given the uncertain loyalties of those within the walls. With a quick exchange of formalities, the Dornish caravan was directed around the perimeter road to where tents bearing the Targaryen sigil clustered in the gathering twilight. The area was a hive of activity, with unsullied standing watch, wagons hauling in supplies, and various lords and ladies milling about in conversation. Arianne dismounted outside the largest pavilion, its entrance guarded by two unsullied with tall spears, and passed them with a polite nod. Inside, lanterns illuminated a broad space filled with maps, chests, and a large table. Daenerys Targaryen stood at one side, conferring with Tyrion Lannister, whose quick eyes darted toward Arianne as she entered. Missandei was there as well, scribbling notes. Grey Worm lingered near the back, his face impassive as ever. Daenerys's hair was pulled back in intricate braids, and she wore a simple traveling gown of dark fabric, though she carried herself with regal poise. The queen looked up, a smile crossing her face when she saw Arianne. "Princess Arianne," Daenerys greeted, stepping forward. She took Arianne's hands in her own, a sign of both warmth and respect. "I'm pleased you've come safely. We've heard troubling rumors about raids on the roads, but it seems your host is large enough to deter such foolishness." Arianne inclined her head. "Your Grace, we came as soon as we could. Our roads were safer than expected, though we did see the aftermath of many battles. I'm sorry for the chaos your reign inherits, but I believe we stand on the threshold of a new era." Daenerys's gaze flicked to Quentyn, who was entering behind Arianne. "Prince Quentyn," she said gently, noting his sling. "I trust your injuries are healing?" "Well enough," Quentyn replied, bowing slightly. "If you need me on the battlefield again, I will manage. But I hope we're beyond that now." Tyrion gave a thin smile. "We all do, my prince." With the greetings exchanged, they moved to the table where a map of King's Landing and its surroundings lay spread out. Tyrion tapped a point indicating their current location. "We're encamped here, outside the city proper, until we can confirm that no significant resistance remains in the Red Keep. Our scouts report that the Lannister guard within the city is fractured. Many have deserted. A handful still hold the keep in Cersei's name, but they lack leadership and morale." Daenerys nodded. "We're deciding how best to handle the transition. I'd prefer not to shed blood in the streets if it can be avoided." Quentyn frowned, recalling how easily fear and hunger could turn a populace violent. "What about the city watch, the gold cloaks?" Tyrion pursed his lips. "They're divided. Some have thrown open the gates to us. Others remain barricaded in pockets. We suspect those are the ones who fear retribution for taking Cersei's coin. Our plan is to offer a general amnesty if they stand down. If they refuse, we'll have to force the issue, but that will come with risk of civilian casualties." Daenerys's jaw set with determination. "We'll do what must be done, but I will not begin my reign by slaughtering the people I mean to protect." Arianne sensed the weight of this moment. She offered the resources of her Dornish escort to help stabilize the city if needed. That night, under the watchful eyes of the Unsullied, the Martell contingent set up its own series of tents not far from the Targaryen encampment. Dorne's banners fluttered side by side with the red dragon of House Targaryen, a sight reminiscent of the unity they had forged in the cold, except now it stood beneath a star-filled southern sky. From a distance, Arianne could see the flickers of light in King's Landing's many windows, the silhouette of the Great Sept's ruins since it had been destroyed earlier by wildfire, as rumor claimed, and the tall shape of the Red Keep on Aegon's high hill. Her mind spun with the possibilities of what might unfold in the coming days. She had never truly liked King's Landing, too crowded, too rife with intrigue, but she knew that if Daenerys succeeded in claiming her birthright with minimal bloodshed, the city would become the seat of a queen who had proven her willingness to fight for all of Westeros. Early the next morning, Daenerys and her entourage took action. Under a white flag of parley, they entered the city gates with a carefully chosen force, some unsullied to maintain discipline, the loyal gold cloaks who had come over to her side, and a select group of nobles, Arianne among them. They rode through the winding streets where the small folk peered out from alleyways and doors, uncertain whether to cheer or hide. Word had spread quickly that the Dragon Queen was here, that she commanded living flames which had vanquished the undead. A hum of tension accompanied their procession. Grey Worm, leading the Unsullied column, kept a strict formation, scanning for signs of ambush. But though a few stones were thrown by unseen hands from balconies above, no major incident erupted. Many in the crowd were ragged from hunger or illness, but they gazed upon Daenerys with a mixture of hope and fear. When at last the procession reached the Red Keep, they found its great gates barred and a handful of Lannister loyalists upon the walls. Their captain demanded to know by what right Daenerys sought entry. She declared herself openly Daenerys Stormborn of the House Targaryen, rightful queen of the Undulls and the First Men. She offered them one chance to lay down arms and swear fealty, and in return, they would receive mercy. After a tense pause, the gates creaked open. The men inside seemed relieved more than anything, dropping swords and removing helmets. A short negotiation followed, a matter of minutes, overseen by Tyrion Lannister. Once it was clear Cersei was not there and had not been seen in weeks, the Red Keep was surrendered. A strange hush fell over the courtyard as Daenerys and her allies dismounted. Aerion looked around, noting the scorch marks on the walls, remnants of earlier battles. She could almost see the ghosts of past kings and queens in these corridors. The Mad King Aerys, Robert Baratheon, Joffrey, Tommen, all of them part of a brutal tapestry. Now Daenerys Targaryen stood on the threshold, with dragons outside the city, prepared to assume the throne that her ancestors had forged. A collective breath seemed to hold the entire courtyard captive as she ascended the steps leading into the main hall. The gold cloaks who had refused to surrender stood in lines, their arms at their sides, heads bowed. Some looked terrified. Others wore expressions of resignation. Daenerys met their eyes but spoke no words to them yet, leaving them to Tyrion and Grey Worm. Once inside, a more thorough search began. Aerion and Quentyn accompanied Daenerys as they moved through corridors lined with dusty tapestries bearing the Baratheon stag, many of them slashed or torn. The throne room itself still bore the marks of neglect, broken tiles, high windows letting in the pale morning light, and at the far end, the Iron Throne. It was a monstrous seat of black swords, fused by dragonfire centuries ago, a testament to the power of Aegon the Conqueror. Now, after so many wars and so much bloodshed, this seat waited for yet another occupant. Daenerys paused before the dais, her expression unreadable. 1,000 emotions must have coursed through her in that moment. Triumph, sorrow, relief, fear of what lay ahead. No fanfare welcomed her, only the echo of footsteps and the rustle of cloaks as her followers fanned out behind her. With measured grace, she climbed the steps, her hands brushing the jagged edges of the throne. But she did not sit. Not yet. Instead, Daenerys turned to face those present. She announced that King's Landing was now under her protection, that the war against the dead had ended, and that she intended to bring justice and order to the city. Any who wished to dispute her claim could step forward. No one did. Many of the city's commoners peered in from the far end of the throne room, curiosity mingled with awe. A hush blanketed the space until Daenerys gave her next command. The Red Keep storerooms, once stuffed with Lannister wealth and supplies, were to be opened and inventoried, and if possible, bread and basic sustenance would be distributed to the starving. She wanted no more children dying in the streets. Tyrion nodded approvingly, signaling scribes and servants to carry out the Queen's orders. Grey Worm dispatched patrols to ensure the city watch cooperated. Arianne realized she was seeing the first steps of Daenerys' rule in the capital, a rule that would either redeem this place or plunge it further into chaos, depending on how events unfolded. Word of the Red Keep's peaceful surrender spread like wildfire through King's Landing. Within hours, curious small folk flocked closer to the fortress gates. Daenerys took time that afternoon to address a gathering of citizens in the outer courtyard, explaining in plain language that she came to restore peace, not to burn the city. The memory of her father's atrocities still lived in older hearts, and she knew trust would not be won overnight. But she promised fair treatment and swift justice for lawbreakers. It was not a grand coronation, not yet. Rather, it was a statement of presence. She was here, and she would not abandon them. Soldiers who had served Cersei were offered amnesty if they took new oaths of loyalty. If they refused, they could depart the city unharmed, so long as they caused no trouble. Most accepted. A few left, perhaps to seek out the rumored location of Cersei's remnants in the Westerlands. Daenerys made no attempt to stop them. Her priority, she said, was to secure the capital with as little bloodshed as possible. She had no desire for a city of corpses. That evening, Daenerys held a private gathering with her closest advisors and the highborn allies who had come to see her ascend. This included Arianne, Quentyn, Tyrion, Grey Worm, Missandei, and several others. Ser Davos Seaworth had arrived from the north with a small retinue representing Jon Snow's interests, while the king in the north tended to Winter's lingering grasp. Lords from the Stormlands, the Reach, and the Vale trickled in as well, though not all had arrived. The question on everyone's mind was, when would the coronation take place and under what circumstances? Tyrion brought out a list of pressing tasks. The city's governance needed immediate attention, from controlling the flow of refugees to restoring basic sanitation. The Red Keep's labyrinth of passages had to be searched for leftover caches of wildfire. No one wanted a repeat of the September's destruction. The Crown's debts had soared, especially with the Iron Bank of Bravos, which might soon dispatch envoys to demand repayment. Roads leading to the capital needed to be patrolled so that trade could resume. A coronation would symbolize a new start, but it had to be timed so that Daenerys could present herself as a queen already tending to her people's needs, not an aloof monarch seeking only a spectacle. Within these discussions, Arianne played an active role. She offered Dornish troops to help with road security, reasoning that this was in Dorne's interest as much as the Crown's. Stable trade routes meant more commerce for Sunspear. She volunteered cartographers and stonemasons from Dorne's lesser houses to assist in repairing the city's infrastructure. In each proposal, she woven in the subtext that Dorne would remain a strong ally so long as Daenerys reciprocated with respect and favorable trade terms. Daenerys listened intently, occasionally exchanging glances with Missandei to confirm details. The queen was not naive. She recognized that every offer from the lords came with strings attached. Yet she seemed genuinely appreciative of Arianne's approach. Tyrion, for his part, took thorough notes, occasionally raising a bushy eyebrow or tapping his quill on the table when a particularly thorny issue arose, like the question of whether Casterly Rock needed to be subdued next or if it could wait until Daenerys's rule was more consolidated in the capital. That topic inevitably circled back to Cersei Lannister's possible whereabouts. No one present knew exactly where she had gone, only that she had vanished with a handful of loyal knights. Rumors placed her anywhere from the Iron Islands to Old Town. Daenerys stated plainly that she wished to avoid an extended hunt unless Cersei emerged as a true threat. Her main goal was to bring stability and avoid dragging the realm into another bloody conflict so soon after the Great War. If Cersei dared to raise an army in the Westerlands, they would cross that bridge when they came to it. In the end, it was agreed that Daenerys would accept the formal homage of the gathered lords in a week's time. This would be a short ceremony, not the grand coronation. She would take her seat in the throne room and receive the loyalty of those houses present, including the Martells. Afterward, she would dispatch letters across the realm, summoning other lords and ladies to attend a larger coronation ceremony in a month. That event would be a chance for any who had not witnessed her ascent firsthand to come and bend the knee or at least pay their respects. If they refused, they would be making a deliberate choice. Arianne and Quentyn signaled their approval, recognizing this as a balanced plan. It gave them time to return home if they wished or remain in the capital to secure Dorne's place. For now, Arianne decided she would stay. Quentyn too agreed. They would see this transitional period through and ensure Dorne's voice was heard. When the day of homage arrived, the Iron Throne Room was cleared of all but a select few. Unsullied guards posted at the doors admitted only those with legitimate business. Daenerys wore a simple but elegant black gown, trimmed with silver, her hair braided with small dragon-headed pins. She stepped onto the dais and settled onto the Iron Throne, cautiously, as though acutely aware of every sharp edge. Tyrion stood at her right, Missandei at her left. Behind them, Grey Worm and a pair of Unsullied served as silent sentinels. One by one, representatives from the Stormlands, the Reach, the Vale, and the Crownlands came forth to bow and reaffirm their loyalty or declare it anew. Each offered a token, sometimes a piece of local craft, sometimes a vow sealed by a gesture of fealty. Daenerys accepted these graciously, though not without a certain reserve, as if she expected betrayal at any moment. Then came the Martell's turn. Arianne advanced, wearing the distinctive colors of Dorne in a flowing surcoat over fine mail. Quentyn walked just behind her, his face set with the solemn dignity that had grown in him since the war. Both siblings knelt before the throne, heads bowed. In a clear voice, Arianne spoke the words that bound House Martell to the new queen. Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, the first of your name, Queen of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the first men, we, Aerion Martell and Quentyn Martell, pledge to uphold your claim to the Iron Throne, to defend your reign from all threats, and to honor the oaths we have sworn in blood and sacrifice. We offer you the loyalty of Dorne, so long as our rights and freedoms remain respected, and our people remain safe under your protection. May the sun and spear stand ever by the dragon's side. Quentyn repeated the vow, adding quietly, "We fought beside you in the cold wastes of the north. Now we stand with you in the heat of the south. Let all of Westeros know that Dorne's promise is not lightly given." Daenerys paused, her violet eyes flicking over them, then nodded. She bade them rise. In a voice resonant yet tinged with gratitude, she responded, "House Martell has my deepest respect. Your loyalty is a gift I do not take for granted, for I know your history, how fiercely you guard your independence. I vow, in turn, to honor Dorne's legacy, protect its borders, and keep faith with those who have kept faith with me. Rise, Aerion and Quentyn Martell, as friends and allies of the crown." They stood, and the watchers in the throne room applauded, some wholeheartedly, others more perfunctorily. Aerion could sense that not all the lords present were pleased. Some had old resentments toward Dorne. Others might resent the special terms the Martells had historically enjoyed. But no one spoke openly against them. The memory of the Great War's alliance was still fresh enough to subdue petty hostilities. Thus, Daenerys' first official act in the throne room was to receive the homage of Dorne, a symbolic moment that marked the renewal of ties once severed by bloodshed and betrayal. A sense of finality hovered in the air as the Martells took their place among the Queen's sworn supporters. Yet Aerion knew that this was only the beginning. Ahead lay the coronation, the reorganization of a realm battered by wars, and the potential for new conflicts as old powers resisted change. Even the matter of whether the North would remain a separate kingdom or fully integrate under Daenerys' rule was not settled. Jon Snow had not arrived and no formal statement had been made. In the days that followed, Aerion and Quentyn made themselves busy in the capital, forging connections with influential figures. Aerion was especially adept at navigating the serpentine corridors of King's Landing politics, holding small gatherings in the solar that had once served as quarters for visiting nobles during Cersei's reign. She invited the ladies and lords who were curious about Dorne's ways, offering them southern wines and telling them stories of the water gardens. In turn, she learned about their concerns, grain shipments for the starving, fear of pirates along the Blackwater Bay, the uncertain loyalties of houses that had yet to declare for Daenerys. Always, she kept the bigger picture in mind, remembering the vow she had made: Dorne would not be overshadowed again, nor would it stand aloof. In each conversation, she subtly advanced the idea that the realm was changing for the better, that unity need not erase local traditions but could indeed strengthen them. Meanwhile, Quentyn spent time with the City Watch, now restructured under Tyrion's guidance. He wanted to ensure that Dornish travelers would not be harassed and that the Watch was learning to operate as a reliable force rather than a band of bribe-seeking bullies. He also took an interest in the refugees' plight, helping coordinate with local septs to set up bread lines or simple soup kitchens. Ilaria Sand, who had accompanied them, joined in these efforts, applying her knowledge of healing herbs to treat the sick in improvised clinics. Scenes of heartbreak abounded in the city, children orphaned by the wars, impoverished families sleeping in the streets, but Quentyn refused to let cynicism take root. If they had beaten the White Walkers, if they had saved the entire realm from a tide of death, he believed they could also address the cruelty and despair that plagued King's Landing's poorest. Perhaps not immediately, but step by step. Over time, the presence of dragons became part of daily life in the capital. Drogon and Rhaegal took to roosting on the rubbled remains of the dragon pit atop Rhaenys' hill, making a fearsome sight for anyone approach. Shing the city. Their roars occasionally echoed through the streets, sending shivers of both and fear among the populace. But they did not attack unprovoked. Under Daenerys' guidance, the creatures seemed to sense that King's Landing was now their territory to protect. Where once people might have cowered in terror at the idea of dragons overhead, many now saw in them a sign of strength that would deter any would-be rebels or foreign invaders. Merchants even began painting small dragon motifs on their shop signs, hoping to curry favor with the new regime. The day of the coronation approached at last. Invitations had gone out to every corner of the realm, and though not all would arrive in time or at all, a sizable gathering of lords was expected. The ceremony was to take place in the Great September's ruins, an unconventional choice, but Daenerys had insisted that the ashes of the old regime might serve as fertile ground for a new beginning. Tyrion and the Faith were still working on how to make the space presentable, clearing rubble and setting up temporary seating. Many in the city whispered that it was an ill omen to hold a coronation where so many had perished in wildfire. But Daenerys believed it a statement of humility, a reminder that a ruler who grows too arrogant might suffer the same destructive fate as those before her. On the morning of that day, the city awoke to a crisp, clear sky. Bright pennants of red, black, gold, and silver decorated the streets. Crowds gathered behind makeshift barriers, patrolled by a bolstered city watch. A large platform had been erected amid the charred stones of the September's once majestic nave. Aromatic herbs burned in braziers to mask the lingering scent of smoke and death. A hastily constructed dais stood at the far end, draped with Targaryen banners. As the hour drew near, the dignitaries arrived in procession, the Vale Lords in shining plate, the Stormland Knights with their banners in gold and black, the Lesser Lords of the Crownlands, and finally, the Martell contingent in flowing silks that gleamed beneath the sun. A hush descended on the crowd when Daenerys rode in astride a pale mare, dressed in shimmering white-scaled armor that evoked the wings of her dragons. Missandei walked at her side, carrying a cushion upon which rested a crown of Valyrian steel. Tyrion and Grey Worm led the column, flanked by Unsullied in immaculate ranks. There, in the skeleton of what had once been the Great September, Daenerys dismounted and stepped onto the dais. A High Septon, newly chosen by the Faith, a moderate man who had survived the city's upheavals, recited prayers to the Seven, calling on the Father for justice, the Warrior for protection, and the Mother for mercy. A hush fell as he placed the crown upon Daenerys's silver-gold hair, proclaiming her Queen of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. The crowd erupted in cheers, though a few pockets of onlookers remained uncertain. Dragons roared overhead in a moment of perfect, frightening synchronicity, as if celebrating their mistress's ascension. A ripple of awe shuddered through the crowd. Daenerys raised her hands, acknowledging the applause. Even from Arianne's vantage, she stood near the dais with Quentyn. She could see tears glistening in Daenerys's eyes. This was the moment the Targaryen queen had fought for, across oceans and deserts, through betrayals and heartbreak. When the cheers subsided, Daenerys addressed the gathered throng. Her voice carried with surprising clarity in the open space. I claim this crown not by birthright alone, but by the deeds we have accomplished together. Many have died to bring us this day. We have faced terrors from beyond the living world, we have toppled tyrants, and we have paid in blood for the promise of a better future. Let all here know, I will not forget the sacrifices made by my people, my children, for that is how I see you as children of the realm. The Iron Throne has been a symbol of power for generations. Today, I swear to you that I will wield that power with justice and compassion. I will end the abuses that have plagued this city. I will protect the small folk, and I will keep faith with those who keep faith with me. Look to the skies if you doubt my resolve. The dragons have returned to Westeros, not to bring fear, but to guard the peace we have earned. Together, let us begin anew. It was a speech that only lasted a few minutes, but its impact was profound. The crowd roared again. Some knelt, heads bowed. Others wept openly. Even the High Septon, who might have resented the shadow of dragon wings over the realm, seemed moved by the sincerity of her words. Arianne felt a stirring in her own heart. She had known so many rulers who made grand promises, but she believed Daenerys meant every word. The question remained whether the new queen could hold the realm together against the inevitable storms to come, threats from within, from the Iron Islands, from the Westerlands, or from any corner of Essos. But for this single moment, the realm breathed as one, exhaling relief and hope. Shortly after the coronation, the Great War in the north and the subsequent reordering of the south were commemorated in a symbolic ceremony. The lords who had fought the undead and stood by Daenerys' side gathered before the dais. Daenerys honored them each in turn. The men of the north through Ser Davos, the men of the Vale, the Stormlands, the Reach, and finally Dorne. Arianne accepted the queen's gratitude on behalf of her people, feeling the warmth of the midday sun on her skin. A reminder that winter's chill was far away now, though never forgotten. Quentyn stood with her, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. He caught sight of several Dornish captains who had marched north, now wearing fresh attire, but the memory of old battles glimmered behind their eyes. That evening, the city erupted in celebration. Bonfires blazed in squares and on street corners, the flicker of torchlight revealing swirling dancers and frantic drummers. Wine flowed freely, though the watchmen tried to prevent things from getting out of hand. Many lords hosted feasts or private gatherings, forging alliances over cups of Dornish red or Arbor gold. Arianne found herself invited to multiple gatherings, some by friendly lords hoping to gain her ear, others by more cunning types who might try to glean the extent of Dorne's resources. She navigated these social currents with practiced ease, always mindful that she was an ambassador for her people as well as a proud Martell. At one of these gatherings, a small dinner hosted by Tyrion Lannister in the newly reclaimed Tower of the Hand, Arianne sat at a table with Quentyn, Ser Davos, and several minor lords from the Crownlands. Tyrion presided over the meal, filling any awkward silences with witty anecdotes and occasionally poking fun at the pomp of the day's ceremonies. Yet beneath his humor lay a steely sense of purpose. The realm had a queen now, and Tyrion, as Hand, was determined to help her succeed. Over roasted capons and spiced vegetables, they discussed the next steps. The real work would begin at sunrise, and none doubted that a realm battered by war would test Daenerys' vow to rule justly. But at least the lines of communication were open, and the living were free to shape their destiny in ways that had seemed impossible when the White Walkers stood at the gates of Winterfell. In the weeks that followed, Dorne's presence in King's Landing became a fixture of the new court. Arianne and Quentyn each took on roles in Daenerys' councils, offering counsel on everything from trade routes through the Red Mountains to the question of how best to handle a resurgence of outlaws in the Riverlands. Their bond with the Queen was strengthened by the memory of shared peril under the northern snows, and even the more suspicious courtiers soon realized that the Martells were here not to seize power but to ensure Dorne thrived as part of a stable realm. Letters and ravens flew back and forth between Sunspear and King's Landing, orchestrating shipments of precious goods, pomegranates, olives, dates, fine sand silk that found eager buyers among the city's merchants. In turn, the capital sent shipments of barley, milled grain, and other staples to help replenish Dornish stores used up in the Great War. Each evening, after long hours in meetings or riding through the city to quell disputes, Arianne would retire to the private apartments in the Red Keep allocated to the Martells. There, by candlelight, she would sometimes reflect on how far they had come. She remembered standing on the battlements of Winterfell, her breath steaming in the frigid air, staring out at a sea of undead. She recalled the monstrous shape of the Night King, the unnatural chill in his eyes. Had it truly only been a matter of months since that darkest of nights? Now she walked through halls once trod by Aegon the Conqueror, hearing the faint calls of dragons roosting in the distant dragon pit. The realm felt brand new, like a tapestry whose weave had been unraveled and was slowly being stitched back together. Her part in that weaving was no less significant than Daenerys's or Tyrion's. It was a humbling thought and an exhilarating one. The changes were not limited to the political sphere. Craftsmen from Dorne, the Reach, and the Crownlands began collaborating on grand rebuilding projects. The damage from Cersei's wildfire explosion at the September was immense. Reconstructing a place of worship would take years, and no one wanted the new sept to carry the sins of the old. Instead, Daenerys gave permission for a memorial garden to be planted among the ruins where visitors could remember the fallen of all conflicts, king, commoner, knight, or septon. Architects debated designs that mixed Dornish arches with classic undul columns in a symbolic melding of cultures. Arianne was invited to review sketches, and she found herself intrigued by the idea. In the old days, such a melding might have been unthinkable. Dorne had always stood apart. Now, the lines of separation were blurring, replaced by a shared sense of resilience. Not everyone embraced these changes, of course. A fraction of the population grumbled that the Targaryens should restore the sept to its full glory and that Dorne's involvement smacked of foreign intrusion. But they were, for the moment, a vocal minority overshadowed by the relief that the city was not burning. And beyond King's Landing, the realm stirred to life. Reports from Winterfell indicated that the snows were melting at last, slower than in the south, but enough to give hope that planting might begin. Jon Snow remained there, ensuring the north recovered properly, but rumors suggested he would soon travel south to treat with Daenerys, or perhaps she would go north to see the land he had saved with her dragons. The Riverlands, once ravaged by multiple armies, were gradually stabilizing under local leadership. The Ironborn, led by Queen Yara, had largely pulled back to their isles, though some whispered they might soon pay their respects to Daenerys. The Westerlands remained a question mark, overshadowed by the possibility that Cersei lurked in the shadows. But for now, no large Lannister force had materialized to challenge the new queen. The wheels of governance, so long rusted by war, began to turn again. For Dorne, the path ahead promised both opportunities and obstacles. Arianne received letters from Sunspear detailing local disputes, House Ironwood quarreling with House Euler over grazing rights, the Stepstones seeing an uptick in smuggler traffic, tensions with the free city of Tyrosh over maritime borders. Ordinarily, such concerns would occupy a princess's every waking hour. But now her duties stretched far beyond the Red Mountains. Balancing the needs of her homeland with the demands of a position at court was no easy feat, yet she felt a sense of pride. House Martell was finally free of the isolation and bitterness that had so often defined it in the past. Their role in defeating the White Walkers had granted them a seat at the table where the realm's fate was decided. It was both exhilarating and heavy with responsibility. At night, sometimes Arianne dreamed of the battle in the north. She would see the blank eyes of the Whites, the swirling snow, the moment the Night King shattered under Valyrian steel. She would wake with her heart pounding, unsure for a heartbeat if it was all over. But then she would hear the gentle lap of the Blackwater rush outside the walls or the distant cry of a gull and remember that she was in King's Landing, that the sun had risen on a realm no longer haunted by the undead. The Great War was done, leaving behind a scarred but living world. And that world was now at a crossroads with Daenerys Targaryen on the throne and House Martell at her side. Time would tell if their fragile unity endured. Ambition and vengeance still simmered in certain hearts. The Iron Bank of Bravos would soon knock upon the throne's door, seeking recompense. The question of how to integrate the North, whether Jon Snow would remain a separate king or become warden, hung in the air. The Westerlands under a scattered Lannister loyalty was another possible powder keg. And beyond the seas, Essos teemed with opportunists who might turn their eyes west now that dragons had become a reality again. But for the moment, the memory of the White Walkers, the unstoppable tide of death, reminded everyone that unity was not just a convenience, it had been the key to survival. If they had done the impossible once, forging alliances across old hatreds to preserve the living, perhaps they could do it again to create a realm worth preserving. In the end, that was the legacy of House Martell's march north. It proved that the scorching desert and the frozen tundra need not remain worlds apart. It revealed that even the most profound differences, culture, climate, tradition, could be set aside in the face of a greater threat. And having conquered that threat, the lords and ladies of Westeros found themselves with the unexpected freedom to decide what came next. For Arianne Martell, that future was one of tempered hope. She would never forget the bone-deep cold of Winterfell's nights, nor the silent terror of facing an army that felt no fear. But she also remembered the warmth of camaraderie that sprang up between strangers who realized they were fighting for the same cause, life itself. And as she moved through the corridors of the Red Keep, the Son of Dorne etched in the fabric of her cloak, she carried that warmth with her, a promise of what might be possible when the living stood as one. So the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, with Daenerys Targaryen seated on the Iron Throne, forging a new chapter in Westeros' story. Dorne's banners flew proudly among the realm's standards, signifying a bond that had been tested on battlefields of ice and sealed in halls of power. The horrors of the White Walkers became distant legend, though scars remained in the hearts of those who had witnessed them. The memory of that final march, the spears of Dorne piercing the undead ranks, the dragons lighting the sky, the ancient enemy splintering into shards of ice, lived on in song and story. Minstrels from Sunspear to White Harbor sang of the day men from the deserts joined men from the snows to turn aside the end of the world. Children in the alleys of King's Landing played at being Martell spearmen or Northern Rangers, reenacting the legendary clash of fire and ice. And though time would inevitably erode the sharp edges of recollection, the bonds formed in that desperation became the cornerstone of a realm reborn. If one were to walk the battlements of the Red Keep and gaze out over King's Landing in the months after Daenerys' coronation, one might see a city slowly knitting itself back together. Markets reopened, orphans were given shelter in charitable septhouses, the city watch patrolled more diligently than ever. And in the harbor, ships from Dorne unloaded cargo alongside vessels from the Arbor, Pentos, and Bravos, carrying the promise of trade and prosperity. Dorne's place in this bustling tapestry was not merely as an outsider or a rebellious province, but as a respected contributor. Arianne knew that the future held no certainties. The realm had a way of spinning on an unpredictable axis, but for the moment she allowed herself a measure of satisfaction. Her people had traveled to the edge of the world, confronted an evil beyond mortal comprehension, and survived. More than survived, they had risen, bringing their fiery spirit from the scorching sands to the land of winter, forging an alliance that transcended the old boundaries. At times, she would recall her final glimpse of Winterfell, the solemn walls dusted with snow, a hush drifting over the courtyard where so many of her men had shed blood. She would recall Jon Snow's earnest eyes, the quiet confidence of a man who cared little for titles, and Daenerys Targaryen's unwavering resolve. She would think of the dead who never returned to their desert home, souls that gave their last breath in an alien, frozen land so that children in Dorne might sleep safely. Those sacrifices lent a grave significance to every new step the realm took. Each decision in the Queen's Council, each treaty penned, each border secured, felt like a piece of the future shaped by those who had fallen. House Martell's banner, the sun pierced by a spear, was a daily reminder that no matter how dark the night, the sun would rise again. And so it was that if any traveler asked the folk of Sunspear, what became of that great army that marched north, they would hear tales of valor and heartbreak, of wights laid low by Dornish steel, of roars echoing from dragons overhead, of the moment a quiet hush fell when the Night King was destroyed. They would hear how the men and women of Dorne returned weary but triumphant, how they helped crown the new Targaryen queen, and how they stayed on to ensure the promise of unity was kept. And should that traveler ever wander the halls of the Red Keep in the wake of Daenerys Targaryen's coronation, they might come upon a wide solar with tall windows overlooking Blackwater Bay. There, a princess of Dorne, dark-haired and poised, might be found conferring with scribes, signing trade agreements, or drafting letters to distant lords. A slender scar might mar her wrist, the only visible token of battles fought in the icy gloom. But in her steady gaze, one would see the unbroken flame of the Dornish spirit, a reminder of the day the sun rose in the north to drive back the cold shadows, and a testament to what the realm could achieve when united beneath a single purpose. For though seasons would change, kings and queens would come and go, and storms of steel and cunning would rage anew, the memory of that unity endured. House Martell's march north to defeat the White Walkers stood as proof that men and women, highborn and low, could transcend the differences of land and blood. That, in the end, might be the finest legacy of the war beyond the wall. Not the songs of victory or the trophies of conquest, but the fragile, shining idea that if the living would only stand together, there was no darkness they could not overcome. And in that, Dorne, once so far removed from the affairs of the North, would forever stand at the center of the story, spear held high against the long night, bringing dawn to a realm on the brink of endless winter.